Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a place beneath the surface of Verath Secundus where the darkness has weight. It presses against you like water at the bottom of an ocean, thick and suffocating, and older than any star currently burning in the night sky above. The darkness there does not simply exist because light has failed to reach it. It persists because something deliberate and ancient decided, millions of years before the first human ever lit a fire, that this place would never know illumination again. The corridors stretch for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, carved with a precision that defies anything the younger species of the galaxy could hope to replicate. Every angle is exact. Every surface has been machined to tolerances measured in units smaller than atoms. Thus, the walls themselves are composed of a material that shifts and flows with glacial slowness, alive in a way that mocks the very concept of biology. This is necrodermis, living metal, a substance that predates the Imperium of man by a span of time so vast that human calendars lack the notation to properly express it. 60 million years, give or take a handful of millennia, that would themselves encompass the entirety of recorded human history several times over. And within this living metal, something stirs. Not quickly. Nothing happens quickly in a Necron tomb world. Urgency is a concept that belongs to species who measure their existence in decades rather than epochs. But stirring nonetheless, like the first tremor before a continental earthquake, like the barely perceptible change in current that precedes a tidal wave. Something is wrong in the deep places of Verath Secundus, and the machines that have stood vigil for 60 million years are beginning to notice. The Canoptek scarabs detect it first. They always do. These are not the scarabs of ancient Terran civilizations, not golden beetles carved into stone and placed in the tombs of pharaohs. These are insectile constructs of living metal, each one no larger than a human fist, scurrying through the labyrinthine corridors on legs that move with mechanical perfection. They have been doing this since before the rise and fall of the Aeldari Empire, since before the war in heaven consumed the galaxy in a conflagration that reshaped the very laws of physics. Their task is simple and eternal: patrol, detect, report, repair. They move in swarms of thousands, of their tiny bodies catching the faint green glow that emanates from the energy conduits embedded in the corridor walls. That glow is the heartbeat of the tomb, the slow pulse of power that keeps the sleeping dynasty alive in their crypts of blackstone and necrodermis. It has beaten, without interruption, for longer than most civilizations have existed. It will continue to beat, long after most currently living things have turned to dust and memory. But something has changed the rhythm of that heartbeat, and the scarabs have noticed. Deep in the western subvaults, in a section of the tomb that was sealed and forgotten even before the Great Sleep began, there is an anomaly. The scarabs cannot define it with their limited processing capacity. Their sensor arrays register it as a contradiction, a thing that should not be where it is. It radiating energies that the tomb's systems have no protocol for interpreting. It is warm where the tomb is cold. It hums with a frequency that does not match the mathematical precision of Necron power systems. And most perplexing of all, it radiates something that the scarabs can only classify as a psychic signature, a whisper of the immaterium bleeding through the material universe like ink through paper. This is deeply wrong. This is fundamentally incompatible with everything the tomb was designed to suppress and contain. The scarabs relay their findings to the nearest Canoptek spider, a massive arachnid construct that serves as a node in the tomb's maintenance hierarchy. The spider processes the data with considerably more sophistication than its smaller cousins and reaches a conclusion that its programming finds deeply troubling. There is an intruder in the tomb. Not a living intruder, not exactly, but something that defies easy classification. Something that is simultaneously mechanical and organic, technological and mystical, dormant and yet radiating power. The spider dispatches a priority signal through the tomb's communication network, a web of interdimensional frequencies that can carry data through solid rock and the spaces between atoms. The signal reaches the central command nexus in microseconds, traveling through circuits that have been quietly self-repairing for millions of years. And in that nexus, a consciousness that has been slumbering since before humanity's ancestors descended from the trees begins the long, grinding process of awakening. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand what the Necrons of Vareth Secundus found in their tomb, and what they chose to do about it, we need to understand how it got there in the first place. And for that, we need to go back. Not 60 million years, but merely a few centuries. A blink of an eye by Necron standards, though more than long enough for the Imperium of man to lose entire worlds to the darkness that presses in from every side. This is the story of what happens when the oldest race in the galaxy encounters one of the most closely guarded secrets of one of the youngest. This is the story of immortal machines and entombed warriors, of sleeping gods and dreaming soldiers, of a collision between two very different kinds of eternity that should never have occurred. And like all the best stories from the 41st millennium and beyond, it begins with a battle that went wrong. Let us talk about the Grey Knights, because unless you understand them, the significance of what the Necrons found in their tomb will be lost entirely, and the Grey Knights are not easy to understand. They are, in many ways, the most contradictory force in the entire Imperium of man, which is saying something in a civilization that worships a dying god-emperor and fights holy wars with chainswords. The Grey Knights are space marines. That much is straightforward enough. They are genetically enhanced superhuman warriors, standing head and shoulders above ordinary men, clad in power armor that could shrug off weapons that would turn a battle tank into scrap metal. They carry bolters that fire mass reactive shells capable of punching through reinforced ceramite. They are strong enough to bend steel with their bare hands, fast enough to dodge gunfire, and tough enough to survive wounds that would kill an ordinary soldier 10 times over. But describing the Grey Knights as merely space marines is like describing an ocean as merely wet. It is technically accurate and completely inadequate, because the Grey Knights are something else entirely, something stranger, something darker, something that the Imperium keeps hidden even from its own defenders. Every Grey Knight is a psyker, every single one. In a galaxy where psychic ability is viewed with suspicion, bordering on terror by the general population, where the mere hint of witch sight can get you burned at the stake by a zealous preacher or shipped off on one of the black ships to feed the Golden Throne's insatiable appetite for souls. But the Grey Knights represent a chapter of 1,000 space marines who are all, without exception, wielders of the warp's power. They channel psychic energies through specialized circuits woven into their armor, through the hexagrammic wards carved into every surface of their war gear, through the silver purity seals implanted beneath their skin. They use the power of the immaterium, the very substance of chaos itself, to fight chaos. They turn the enemy's greatest weapon back upon it, wielding sorcery with a precision and purity that even the most powerful demon princes cannot match. Their armor is called Aegis armor, and it is a masterwork of psychic engineering that has no equal anywhere in the Imperium. Every plate, every joint, every rivet is inscribed with prayers and wards, ritually consecrated and psychically charged. The Aegis does not merely protect the body, it protects the soul. It creates a field of psychic nullification around the wearer that makes demons recoil in pain and horror, that causes the very fabric of the warp to pull back like flesh from a hot brand. A Grey Knight in full Aegis armor is anathema to everything that the Chaos Gods represent. His presence alone can banish lesser demons, and his focused psychic assault can challenge even the mightiest servants of the Dark Powers. They are Chapter 666. The number is not a coincidence. It is a declaration of intent, a challenge thrown into the teeth of the ruinous powers. They are the Imperium's final line of defense against the demonic, the silver sword that guards the boundary between the material universe and the screaming madness of the warp. Their fortress monastery sits on Titan, As the largest moon of Saturn, hidden behind psychic wards so powerful that Malkador the Sigillite himself wove them into the very fabric of reality during the darkest days of the Horus heresy. They are the Emperor's secret weapon, created by his direct order and forged from his own genetic legacy. Their gene seed is unique among all Space Marine chapters. It does not derive from any of the 20 Primarchs, those demigod sons of the Emperor who led the Great Crusade, and half of whom fell to chaos during the heresy. Instead, the Grey Knights carry gene seed engineered directly from the Emperor's own genome. This gives them a psychic potency that no other chapter can match, and a resistance to corruption that has never, in over 10,000 years of service, been breached. Not one Grey Knight has ever fallen to chaos, not one. As in a galaxy where entire legions of Space Marines turned traitor, where Primarchs themselves knelt before the Dark Gods, the Grey Knights have maintained their purity without exception. It is a record that speaks to the extraordinary nature of these warriors and the terrifying standards to which they are held. But Grey Knights die. Even the finest warriors in the Imperium are not immune to the violence of the galaxy. They fall in battle against demons and heretics, against alien horrors and corrupted warlords. And sometimes, like their brothers in other chapters, a Grey Knight is wounded so grievously that death seems the only possible outcome, and yet his body clings to life with the stubbornness that is the birthright of all Space Marines. When this happens in other chapters, the wounded Marine is offered what is described as the greatest honor a Space Marine can receive. His shattered body is removed from its ruined armor and placed within the armored sarcophagus of a Dreadnought, a towering cybernetic war machine that will carry him back into battle for centuries, perhaps millennia, to come. His consciousness is wired into the Dreadnought's systems, his thoughts becoming the machine's commands, his rage and determination powering weapons that can level buildings and shatter tank formations. For most chapters, being interred in a Dreadnought is an honor beyond measure. It means that the chapter's leadership considers your experience and wisdom too valuable to lose, your connection to the chapter's history too precious to allow death to sever. Dreadnoughts are revered as living ancestors, or walking relics of the chapter's glorious past. They are woken from their long sleeps between battles to offer counsel to chapter masters and to inspire young Marines with tales of victories won in ages past. The Grey Knights see it differently. For the Grey Knights, interment in a Dreadnought is not an honor eagerly sought. It is a necessity reluctantly accepted. Grey Knights who fall in battle would prefer, almost universally, to be carried to the crypts beneath the temple of the Emperor on Titan, there to rest among their brothers in the cool silence of the dead fields. Their names would be carved into the walls of their crypts, alongside those of other great warriors, and that would be a fitting end to a lifetime of service against the most terrible enemies the galaxy has to offer. But sometimes, the chapter's need outweighs individual desire. Sometimes, the wisdom and psychic power of a fallen Grey Knight is too valuable to allow to pass beyond the veil. And so, with the warrior's consent, which is always sought and sometimes barely given, the broken body is transferred into the armored shell of a Grey Knight's Dreadnought. These are not ordinary Dreadnoughts. They are among the rarest and most advanced variants in the entire Imperium. Their sarcophagi are laced with cyber circuitry that allows the entombed warrior to continue channeling his psychic abilities, projecting his Aegis field outward to protect nearby battle brothers. Their chassis is inscribed with the same hexagrammic wards and anti-demonic prayers that adorn Grey Knight's power armor, making them living bastions of psychic defense. A Grey Knight's Dreadnought on the battlefield is not merely a weapons platform. It is a psychic fortress, a walking sanctuary of anti-demonic power that can project its protective field across an entire combat zone. And it is one of these Dreadnoughts, one of the rarest and most powerful weapons in the Imperium's arsenal, that somehow ended up buried in the deepest vaults of a Necron tomb world, sleeping among the ancient machines of a civilization that remembers the birth of stars. dreaming whatever dreams a half-dead superhuman psyker dreams, when his consciousness drifts through the mechanical twilight of a Dreadnought's stasis cycle. The question of how it got there is a story in itself, and it begins with a name. Brother Captain Theron Galliard of the Grey Knight's Fourth Brotherhood. A warrior who had served the Emperor for over 300 years before a greater demon's blade found the seam between his gorget and his helm and nearly took his head from his shoulders. A psyker of such raw power that even the chapter's prognosticators agreed his loss would be grievous beyond measure. A man who gave his consent to interment with a single whispered word that might have been acceptance or might have been despair. That was 427 years ago. In the centuries that followed, ancient Galliard served the Grey Knights with the same distinction that had marked his career as a flesh-and-blood warrior. He was woken for campaigns against demon incursions on 17 worlds, his psychic might and tactical wisdom proving decisive in engagements that would have overwhelmed lesser forces. His Aegis field was so powerful that lesser demons simply could not manifest within 50 meters of his chassis. His nemesis Doomfist, a close combat weapon unique to Grey Knight's Dreadnoughts, had banished entities that lesser warriors could not even perceive. But between those campaigns, he slept. And in his sleep, something happened that no one could have predicted. The Grey Knight's strike cruiser Sword of Purity was transiting through the Vareth system on its way to respond to a demonic incursion in the Calixis sector, when reality itself seemed to convulse around them. A warp storm of unprecedented violence erupted without warning, tearing at the ship's Geller field with a fury that suggested malicious intelligence rather than natural phenomenon. The Sword of Purity was a Grey Knight's vessel, warded against the warp's influence with every protection that the Imperium's most advanced psychic engineering could provide. Under normal circumstances, it could have weathered the storm with relative ease. But these were not normal circumstances. The storm was not random. It was targeted, directed at the ship with a precision that spoke of demonic orchestration. The Geller field held, barely, but the violence of the storm threw the ship off course by thousands of light years, sending it tumbling through the immaterium like a leaf in a hurricane. When the navigators finally managed to force a translation back into real space, the Sword of Purity emerged in a system that did not appear on any Imperial star chart. Verath. The ship was damaged, its engines sputtering, its Geller field generators scorched and threatening to fail entirely. Yet the navigators could not determine their location with any certainty. The astropaths could not project a distress call through the psychic interference that blanketed the system like a funeral shroud. Captain Varian Drask, commanding the strike force aboard the Sword of Purity, made the decision to set down on the nearest habitable world to effect repairs. That world was Verath Secundus, a lifeless, barren rock that showed no signs of habitation, no cities, no settlements, no electromagnetic emissions, no life signs, just empty desert and bare stone stretching to every horizon under a dim, distant sun. They did not know what lay beneath their feet. The ship landed in a basin of grey dust that had once been a sea, millions of years before the planet's oceans had boiled away, and tech servitors began repairs while the Grey Knights maintained a defensive perimeter, their psychic senses straining against the strange, dead feeling that permeated the planet's atmosphere. Something about Verath Secundus felt wrong to them, empty in a way that went beyond mere lifelessness, as if the planet itself had been deliberately sterilized of something more fundamental than biological organisms. Ancient Galliard was still in his stasis cradle in the ship's lower decks, sleeping the dreamless sleep of the entombed. His systems were on minimal power, just enough to keep his biological components alive and his psychic field dormant. He had no awareness of the emergency, no knowledge of the forced landing, no sense of the danger that was closing in from below, because something had noticed the Grey Knight's arrival. Deep beneath the surface of Verath Secundus, in the silent corridors of a tomb that had slept undisturbed for 60 million years, Canoptek scarabs were registering an intrusion. Living things had set foot on the surface of their world. warm things, things that pulsed with the hated energies of the warp. And the tomb's defense protocols, dusty and degraded, but still functional after all these millennia, began to activate. What happened next has been reconstructed from fragmentary records recovered by the Ordo Malleus decades later. The Grey Knights were ambushed by the tomb's automated defenses while their ship was still undergoing repairs. Canoptek constructs emerged from the ground like nightmares, their living metal bodies flowing through solid rock as if it were water. Tomb Sentinels, a massive centipede-like machines capable of phasing through matter, struck at the defensive perimeter with exile cannons that banished anything they touched into pocket dimensions outside normal spacetime. Canoptek wraiths materialized inside the ship itself. Their phase-shifted forms, passing through hull plating and bulkheads to strike at the tech servitors working on the damaged engines. The Grey Knights fought back with everything they had. Bolt rounds blessed with sacred oils tore into necrodermis, causing the living metal to momentarily lose cohesion before its self-repair protocols restored the damage. Psychic fire blazed through the corridors of the ship, incandescent with anti-demonic power that, ironically, proved somewhat effective against the Necron constructs as well. As the Aegis fields that protected the Grey Knights disrupted the targeting systems of the Canoptek Guardians, causing their weapons to fire erratically, but there were too many. The tomb's defenses were designed to repel invasions by entire armies, and the Grey Knights numbered barely 50 warriors. For every construct they destroyed, 2 more emerged from the ground to take its place. The tomb sentinels were nearly impossible to put down permanently. Their living metal bodies regenerated damage faster than the Grey Knights could inflict it, and their exile cannons were devastating, each shot potentially removing a battle brother from the fight permanently. Captain Drask ordered a fighting retreat back to the Sword of Purity, but the ship's engines were still offline. They were trapped on a hostile world, surrounded by enemies that could not be permanently destroyed, with no way to call for reinforcement and no way to escape. And then it got worse. The tomb's primary defense grid interpreted the continuing presence of the intruders as a major threat and escalated its response accordingly. The ground itself began to shift, the surface of the planet cracking open in concentric rings around the Grey Knight's position as massive structures rose from beneath the desert. These were not mere Canoptek constructs. These were the outermost bastions of the tomb itself, weapon emplacements that had been buried beneath kilometers of rock and dust, now surfacing for the first time in 60 million years. Gauss projectors, the size of building spires, opened fire with beams of sickly green energy that stripped matter apart at the molecular level. The Sword of Purity's hull, which had survived warp storms and demon attacks, began to dissolve under the assault, its adamantium plating peeling away in layers like the skin of an onion. The Grey Knight's psychic wards provided some protection, their Aegis fields deflecting the Gauss energy in coruscating bursts of silver fire. But the sheer volume of fire was overwhelming. It was during the final stages of this desperate battle that the thing happened. The event that would lead, centuries later, to the discovery that would confound a Necron overlord and challenge the assumptions of a civilization that had existed for longer than most stars. A stray Gauss beam struck the section of the Sword of Purity where ancient Galliad's stasis cradle was housed. The beam did not destroy the Dreadnought. Grey Knight's Dreadnoughts are among the most heavily warded and protected pieces of military hardware in the entire Imperium, and Galliad's chassis was no exception. Every surface was inscribed with hexagrammic wards, every joint sealed with blessed unguents, every plate of ceramite layered with prayers of protection that had been renewed by the chapter's tech marines for over 4 centuries. But the beam did something else. It severed the power conduits linking Galliad's stasis cradle to the Sword of Purity's main reactor, and it cracked the deck plating beneath the cradle, opening a fissure that extended downward through the ship's hull and into the ground below. The ground that was, in fact, the roof of a sealed Necron subvault. Galliard's stasis cradle, its magnetic clamps disabled by the power loss. He slid through the widening fissure and fell. It fell through decks of dying ship, through cracked rock and compressed dust, through the necrodermis ceiling of a corridor that had not been opened in 60 million years. It fell for what felt like forever, and then it stopped, caught by the tomb's own mechanisms. The living metal of the corridor floor flowed around the cradle like water, absorbing the impact and then hardening again, trapping the Dreadnought in place as neatly as if it had been designed to fit there all along. Above, the battle raged to its conclusion. The Grey Knights, realizing the ship was lost, fought a final, desperate action that allowed a small group of survivors to reach an escape shuttle and break free of the planet's atmosphere. They fled into the void, eventually managing to send a psychic distress call that would take decades to reach the nearest Imperial outpost. Behind them, the Sword of Purity burned on the surface of Farthest Secundus, its wreckage slowly being dismantled and consumed by swarms of Canoptek scarabs. In the confusion and desperation of the retreat, no one had time to check on ancient Galliard's stasis cradle. No one realized that the venerable Dreadnought had not been destroyed in the ship's demise, but had instead fallen into the very heart of the enemy's domain. And there he remained, for centuries, sleeping in the darkness, dreaming in the silence, his stasis systems running on emergency power drawn from the miniature plasma reactor that powered his Dreadnought chassis. His psychic field dampened to the barest whisper by the stasis protocols, but never entirely silent, never entirely dormant. A faint, persistent glow of warp energy, barely perceptible against the background radiation of the tomb, but undeniably, unmistakably there. A candle flame in a cathedral of darkness, and the Necrons slept around him, unaware of the alien presence that had infiltrated their most sacred spaces. The Canoptek Guardians registered the cradle as an anomaly, flagged it in their maintenance protocols, and then moved on to more pressing concerns, like the ongoing degradation of stasis, Crypt 447 Sigma, or the hairline fracture in power conduit 12 Gamma that had been slowly widening for the past 3 million years. In the hierarchy of a tomb world's maintenance priorities, a single inert object in a sealed subvault ranked somewhere below routine and well above trivial, until now. Until the tomb began to wake. The awakening of a Necron tomb world is not a sudden thing. It does not happen like a light being switched on or a sleeper being shaken awake. It is more like the changing of seasons, if the seasons were measured in centuries rather than months, and if each one brought not warmth and growth but cold awareness and mechanical purpose. The process begins at the edges and works inward, like ice forming on a pond, starting with the outermost defenses and automated systems, and gradually progressing toward the core, where the dynasty's nobility slumber in their ornate sarcophagi. On Farthest Secundus, the awakening had been triggered by a cascade of factors that the tomb's systems had been unable to prevent. The chronostat, a device programmed to initiate revival at a specific point in the galactic calendar, and had malfunctioned during the 60 million year hibernation. It ran fast by a factor of several thousand years. The tomb should not have been waking now. It should have had another 10 millennia of undisturbed sleep ahead of it. But malfunctions cascade in systems that have been running for epochs. The early activation of the chronostat triggered the revival of the primary Canoptek systems ahead of schedule, which drew additional power from the central reactor, which caused temperature fluctuations in the stasis crypts, which began reviving the tomb's occupants before their scheduled time. It was a chain reaction of mechanical happenstance, each step making the next inevitable, each malfunction feeding into the next, until the entire tomb was grinding its way toward consciousness, like a vast machine that had been running in idle for longer than the human species had existed. The Canoptek spiders were fully operational within the first standard year. These massive constructs, each one the size of a human battle tank, moved through the corridors on anti-gravitic engines, their fabricator arrays and sensor suites scanning every surface, every conduit, every stasis crypt for signs of damage or degradation. What they found was not encouraging. 60 million years of hibernation had taken its toll on even the most advanced technology in the galaxy. Stasis crypts had failed throughout the tomb, their occupants reduced to dust or corrupted beyond recovery. Power conduits had degraded, as their necrodermis sheaths cracked and flaking. Entire sections of the tomb had collapsed under geological pressure. The tomb world of Farthest Secundus was not waking refreshed and ready. It was waking wounded, diminished, a shadow of what it had been when the Great Sleep began. But it was waking. And as the Canoptech spiders compiled their comprehensive inventory, scanning every chamber, mapping every corridor, logging every anomaly, the anomaly in the western sub-vaults was finally flagged for closer examination. What they found confused them. The object in sub-vault 12 Gamma was approximately 4 meters tall, roughly humanoid in shape, and composed of materials that the spider's sensor arrays could not fully identify. Parts of it were ceramite, a compound familiar from encounters with various younger species, or parts of it were adamantium. But interwoven with these mundane materials were substances and energies that defied the spider's analytical capabilities. There were inscriptions covering nearly every surface, rendered in a language that the tomb's translation algorithms could not parse. The symbols were organized in precise geometric patterns, spirals and hexagrams, and interlocking circles that radiated a faint but undeniable psychic resonance. The spider's sensor arrays recoiled from these inscriptions, their readings distorted whenever they attempted direct scans. More disturbing still was the energy signature emanating from within the object. It was weak, barely above the detection threshold, but it was unmistakably organic. There was something alive inside the machine, something warm, something that, impossibly, appeared to be dreaming. The spiders reported their findings to the next level of the tomb's command hierarchy and waited for instructions. In the meantime, they deployed a ring of Canoptech scarabs to monitor the anomaly continuously. The scarabs settled into their positions with patient diligence. They watched the silent hulk of the Grey Knight's Dreadnought with eyes that had been watching things since before the first fish crawled out of Terran oceans. They saw the faint shimmer of the dormant Aegis field, the barely perceptible pulse of stasis indicator lights, the slow rise and fall of life support readouts that suggested something inside the machine was breathing. And they waited. They were very good at waiting. They had had 60 million years of practice. As the first Necron of noble rank to lay eyes on the Grey Knight's Dreadnought was not the tomb's overlord. It was a cryptech named Seth Ra, a master of the discipline known as ethermancy, the manipulation of energy in its purest forms. Seth Ra had been among the first of the tomb's non-Canoptech occupants to be revived. Her expertise needed to diagnose and repair the power distribution failures plaguing the awakening process. We should take a moment to understand what a cryptech is, because they occupy a unique and fascinating position within Necron society. In the days when the Necrons were still the Necron Tyre, before the biotransference that traded their flesh for living metal, the cryptechs were scientists and engineers. They were the minds that designed the ships which carried the Necrontyr across the galaxy, as the weapons that fought the war in heaven, the stasis crypts that preserved the Necron dynasties during the Great Sleep. They occupied a privileged position in the Necrontyr hierarchy, valued for their brilliance and feared for their eccentricities. This has not changed in the 60 million years since biotransference. If anything, the transformation into mechanical forms has only amplified the cryptechs' obsessive dedication to their craft and their sometimes alarming disregard for anything that does not directly relate to their area of expertise. Seth Ra was no exception. She had been a brilliant ethermancer even before the biotransference, renowned across the dynasty for her ability to manipulate energy fields with a precision that bordered on artistry. In her mechanical form, stripped of biological limitations, yet her abilities had only grown. She could sense energy flows the way a mortal might sense the wind on their face, could trace the path of a single photon through kilometers of necrodermis conduit, could diagnose a fault in a power relay by the way it altered the ambient electromagnetic field of a room. When the Canoptech spider's report reached her, Seth Ra was intrigued. The energy readings were unlike anything in her considerable experience. She had studied the crude atomic technologies of younger species. She had analyzed the psychic emanations of warp-sensitive beings. She had even examined captured examples of Eldari wraithbone. None of it prepared her for what she found when she descended into the western subvaults. The Dreadnought was exactly as the spiders had described it. 4 meters of ceramite and adamantium, roughly humanoid, covered in inscriptions that made her sensor arrays flinch. But what the report had failed to convey was the sheer wrongness of the thing's presence. It was like finding a campfire burning in the depths of a glacier, a source of warmth and light that had no business existing in a place of cold and darkness. The Dreadnought's dormant aegis field, barely a whisper of power, still managed to create a bubble of psychic energy that felt like putting her hand too close to an open flame. Not painful, not yet, but deeply uncomfortable and fundamentally alien. She circled the Dreadnought slowly, her anti-gravitic form gliding silently through the air. Her sensor arrays swept across its surface, cataloging every inscription, every seal, every purity mark. The mathematical patterns underlying the inscriptions were not entirely unfamiliar. They reminded her of certain formulae she had encountered in the forbidden archives of the tomb, equations describing the relationship between the material universe and that other place, the realm of thought and emotion that the younger species called the warp, and that the Necrons called the enemy. These inscriptions were wards, protections against psychic intrusion, barriers that used the power of the warp itself to create a shell of anti-warp energy. The principle was crude compared to Necron nullfield technology, but Seth Ra had to admit a grudging respect for the ingenuity. Whoever had created these wards had possessed a deep understanding of psychic mechanics and a remarkable ability to harness energy fields that most species could barely perceive. But it was the interior of the Dreadnought that truly captured her attention. Penetrating the wards was difficult, but not impossible. The aegis field was dormant, operating at a fraction of its capacity. What she found inside made her pause, an act that for a Necron cryptech was equivalent to a human gasping in shock. There was a brain in there, not a machine, not a cogitation engine. A brain, an organic, biological, living brain suspended in a nutrient bath within a ceramite sarcophagus at the Dreadnought's core. It was old, far older than any organic tissue had a right to be, sustained by chemical preservatives and mechanical life support systems. And it was active. Even in stasis, the brain was producing neural impulses, electrical signals racing through organic tissue, creating patterns that Seth Ra recognized as thought. The thing inside the machine was not merely alive, it was thinking, dreaming perhaps, but undeniably conscious on some level. A mind wrapped in metal, a soul encased in ceramic and steel. Seth Ra stood before the Dreadnought for a long time, her mechanical form utterly still, her sensor arrays drinking in data. She was performing calculations, running analyses, cross-referencing observations against every relevant database in the tomb's archives. And as the results came in, she reached a conclusion that she knew would have profound implications. This was not merely an anomaly. This was a weapon, and more than a weapon. A prison, and more than a prison. A tomb. Not so different in its fundamental concept from the stasis crypts that surrounded it. Not so different from the mechanical bodies that the Necrons themselves inhabited. A consciousness trapped in metal. The irony was not lost on Seth Ra. Whilst she had been a being of flesh and blood once, 60 million years ago, before the Satan had offered the Necrontyr the poisoned gift of immortality. She had walked under an alien sun, breathed alien air, felt the warmth of another body against her own. All of that was gone now, replaced by the cold precision of necrodermis and the eternal hum of power conduits. She existed as a pattern of energy within a shell of living metal, a mind without a body, a consciousness without a soul.
Honestly, this is one of those concepts that just lives in my head rent-free, because when you really sit with it, the Necrons and Dreadnoughts are basically going through the same thing. They're both trapped, both stuck in bodies they didn't choose, watching themselves fade piece by piece. The only difference is that one side remembers what it lost and the other is still losing it in real time. That hits different when you really think about it. Out of everything I have covered on this channel, this idea right here might be the one that genuinely keeps me up at night. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea that the reward for being the best warrior your chapter has ever seen is that you never get to rest. You just keep going. And the Necrons have been dealing with that same curse for 60 million years. And I think that is why this matchup works so well as a story. It's not about who wins a fight, it's about two sides of the same broken mirror finally seeing each other clearly. But anyway, that's just my take. Let's get back to the video.
And here, in the deepest vault of her people's tomb, was a creature that had suffered the same fate. Different technology, different species, different reasons, but the same fundamental transformation. A being of flesh and blood, reduced to a mind in a machine, had preserved beyond the natural span of its existence by the same desperate refusal to let go that had driven the Necron Tyre to accept the Satan's bargain. Seth Ra did not feel kinship. Cryptex do not feel kinship. But she had always been unusual among her kind. Her engrams had survived the Great Sleep with a degree of integrity that was rare, and there were times when she experienced something that was not quite emotion, but was close enough to make the distinction academic. She turned away from the Dreadnought and sent a priority communication to the tomb's command nexus. The Overlord needed to know about this. She permitted herself one final observation before she departed, a notation in her personal records encrypted with codes known only to herself. The younger species call themselves human. Their technology is crude. Their understanding of the universe fragmentary and naive. But in this one thing at least, they have achieved a feat that mirrors our own. They have found a way to cheat death, and in doing so, they have condemned their greatest warriors to the same purgatory that we imposed upon ourselves 60 million years ago. One wonders if they too consider it an honor. To understand the court of a Necron overlord, you must first abandon every assumption you hold about how civilizations function. Human civilizations are built on commerce and faith. Aeldari civilizations are built on art and foresight. Orc civilizations are built on violence and momentum. Necron civilization is built on hierarchy and protocol. These are not guidelines. They are foundational principles encoded into the very fabric of Necron consciousness, nay, woven into the necrodermis at the molecular level during the biotransference. Every Necron knows its place. Every Necron follows the protocols. These protocols have not changed in 60 million years. They do not need to change. At the apex of the hierarchy, on Verath Secundus was Pharaon Ketep, the Unbroken, ruler of the Saracon dynasty and lord of all he surveyed, which at the moment consisted of a badly degraded tomb world and a court of nobles in various stages of waking up. Ketep had been a formidable figure in the days of the Necrontyre, a military commander of considerable skill, and a politician of even greater cunning. The biotransference had preserved his strategic acumen while stripping away biological weaknesses. The Great Sleep had been less kind. Ketep's engrams had suffered significant degradation, and leaving gaps in his memory that he compensated for with rigid adherence to protocol. He remembered who he was. He remembered his rank and authority. He remembered the general shape of his dynasty's history, but the details, the personal memories, the individual connections that had once given those facts emotional context, these had been eroded by the passage of time, worn smooth like stones in a river until they were little more than data points in a vast and emotionless archive. His court assembled in the Grand Processional, a chamber of such scale that it could have contained a small imperial city within its walls. The ceiling arched hundreds of meters overhead, supported by pillars of living metal that pulsed with the slow green heartbeat of the tomb's power grid. Yet the walls were lined with alcoves containing sarcophagi from which nobles had recently emerged, their necrodermis bodies gleaming with residual revival energy. There were lords and ladies of various ranks. There were Lich Guard, the elite bodyguard units, standing at rigid attention along the central aisle. There were lesser nobles and functionaries. And there were the cryptex, standing apart as they always did, their bizarre forms marking them as a class apart. Seth Ra stood among the cryptex, her report already transmitted through proper channels. She watched as Ketep processed the information with methodical precision. "An intruder in the western sub-vaults," Ketep said, his voice emanating from the vox speakers of his ornate death mask. The mask was a masterwork of necrodermis craftsmanship, at its surface flowing with subtle patterns that changed according to his mood. At the moment, it displayed cold consideration. "How long has it been there?" "Uncertain, my Pharaon. Based on material degradation and energy signature decay, I estimate several centuries at minimum, possibly as long as 500 standard years." A murmur rippled through the court. 500 years was nothing to a Necron, but the fact that an alien object had been sitting in their tomb for that long undetected was an embarrassment. "The Canoptech systems logged it as a low-priority anomaly," Seth Ra continued. "The tomb's maintenance protocols were operating in a degraded state. It was not until the full awakening began that the true nature of the object became apparent." "And what is its true nature?" This was Nemesor-Thotep, the dynasty's chief military commander, a Necron whose form was built for war. Where the nobles' bodies were elegant and ornate, Thotep's was angular and functional. His staff of office doubled as a war scythe, and the green glow of his optical sensors burned with an intensity that suggested a consciousness oriented toward violence. Seth Ra chose her words carefully. "It is a war machine of the species known as humans, specifically a type of armored combat walker designated as a Dreadnought. It contains a living organic component, a human brain, suspended in chemical preservatives and connected to the machine's systems through a neural interface." "A mind in a machine," Ketep said, and if there was irony in his voice, his death mask did not display it. "Precisely, my Pharaon, but there is more. The machine is covered in psychic wards of considerable sophistication. Its energy signature suggests that the organic component is a psyker, a wielder of warp energies. Even in its dormant state, the machine radiates an anti-warp field that my instruments find difficult to penetrate." The murmur that followed was louder and distinctly less pleasant. The Necrons' relationship with the warp was complicated. The Necrons were creatures of the material universe, their consciousness patterns running on quantum circuits rather than psychic matrices. They could not touch the warp, could not perceive it directly, could not manipulate it. This had been both their greatest weakness and their greatest strength for 60 million years. The warp could not corrupt what it could not touch, but neither could the Necrons use the warp's power. Now, the psychic entity in their tomb was not merely an intrusion, it was an abomination, a contamination, a violation of the most fundamental principle governing Necron existence. "Destroy it," said Nemesor-Thotep with characteristic directness. "Whatever this thing is, it has no place in our domain. I recommend immediate elimination." "You recommend hasty action," Seth Ra countered. "The anomaly has been stable for centuries. A few more hours of study will not materially increase the risk, but they may provide valuable intelligence about the capabilities of this species." "The cryptex speaks sense," said another voice. This was Anchoret, the royal warden, whose role combined chief of security, master of intelligence, and lord high executioner. Her form was sleek and predatory, designed for speed and stealth. "We know little about the current state of the galaxy," Anchoret continued. "Our intelligence on the younger species is 60 million years out of date. This object is a gift, not the object itself, but the information it represents. The materials, the technology, the psychic patterns, all of these tell us something about the species that created it. To destroy it without extracting that intelligence would be wasteful. Ketep's death mask shifted through several patterns in rapid succession. "We will study it," the Pharaoh said. "Cryptex Sethra, you will lead the examination. Nemes Thotep, deploy Lichguard to establish a containment perimeter. If the anomaly shows any sign of activating, you are authorized to destroy it. Royal Warden Anchoret, coordinate with Seth Ra to extract whatever intelligence can be gleaned." He paused. And Seth Ra, you said there was a brain inside this machine, a living brain, a thinking brain. Yes, my Pharaoh. Then it is possible that this brain is aware of its surroundings, that it can perceive us, that it can think and plan. It is possible. The stasis systems appear to maintain reduced consciousness rather than true dormancy. Ketep's death mask settled into a pattern none of his courtiers had seen before. It was not any established configuration. It was something older, something that reached back through 60 million years to touch a fragment of something the biotransference had not entirely erased. It was curiosity. "Then we shall have to be careful," the Pharaoh said. "We would not want our guest to wake before we are ready to receive him." The examination proceeded with meticulous thoroughness, as Seth Ra assembled a team of her most skilled subordinates. There was Ankmir, a plasmancer, whose mastery of electromagnetic fields allowed him to map the Dreadnought's internal systems without breaching its hull. There was Netef, a psychomancer specializing in consciousness and neural patterns. And there was Kasset, a technomancer whose affinity for machines made him the obvious choice for dissecting the mechanical systems. They worked in shifts, while the Lichguard stood watch at the perimeter, war scythes humming, optical sensors fixed on the dormant Dreadnought with unwavering attention. Ankmir's electromagnetic mapping revealed the internal architecture in remarkable detail. The chassis was structured around a central sarcophagus, approximately the size of a human coffin, containing the biological component. This sarcophagus was connected to the Dreadnought's systems by thousands of neural interface cables, each thinner than a human hair. The design was elegant in its simplicity, if crude by Necron standards. The brain thought and the machine obeyed. The machine sensed and the brain perceived. But what struck Ankmir most forcefully were the layers of protection surrounding the sarcophagus. The neural interface cables were sheathed in a material combining the physical properties of silver with energy signatures suggesting psychic imprinting. The sarcophagus itself was lined with circuits channeling what Ankmir reluctantly classified as warp energy, psychic power flowing through conduits of blessed metal like blood through veins, and overlaying everything were the wards. The inscriptions grew denser the closer they got to the sarcophagus, until the innermost layers were essentially solid text, prayers and invocations so tightly packed that they formed a seamless shell of psychic armor around the living brain at the machine's core. "The psychic engineering is remarkable," Ankmir reported. "Primitive compared to our null field technology, but effective. The ward structure is self-reinforcing. Each inscription strengthens those adjacent to it, creating a cascading effect that makes the whole far greater than the sum of its parts." Netef's analysis of the biological component was even more revealing. The brain was not merely human. Her sensors detected genetic modifications of staggering complexity, alterations that enhanced neural density, expanded psychic capacity, and dramatically increased resistance to degradation. This was the brain of one of the genetically engineered super soldiers called Space Marines, further modified with psychic augmentations that elevated the already remarkable Astartes physiology to something approaching the preternatural. "The thought patterns are fascinating," Netef reported. "Even in its reduced state, the brain produces neural activity suggesting considerable depth and complexity. The stasis systems have slowed its processes to a fraction of normal speed, but they have not stopped them entirely. The brain is dreaming, cycling through memories and associations. And there is activity in regions associated with spiritual contemplation. The brain appears engaged in some form of meditative or devotional process." "Prayer," Seth Ra said. "I am not familiar with that concept. It is a practice common among humans. They direct their thoughts toward entities they believe to be divine. For psychically active individuals, the process has practical functions. The warp responds to focused psychic intent. Netef processed this. Then this brain is actively channeling psychic energy even in stasis. The prayers, the wards, the anti-warp field, they are not passive systems. They are being maintained by the conscious effort of the mind within. The brain is the power source for its own protection. Cassette's analysis rounded out the picture. The Dreadnought was crewed by Necron standards. Hydraulics instead of anti-gravitic drives. Chemical propellants instead of Gauss technology. A compact plasma reactor that would have been considered primitive millions of years before the Great Sleep. But for all its crudeness, yet it had a brutal efficiency that Cassette grudgingly respected. Every system was optimized for one purpose: keeping the biological component alive and allowing it to fight. No wasted space, no superfluous systems. It was a weapon, pure and simple, designed to take the failing body of a dying warrior and give it the means to continue fighting. The most interesting feature, Cassette reported, is the integration between biological and mechanical components. The neural interface is crude compared to our engram transfer technology, but it achieves a similar result. The brain does not merely control the machine, it inhabits it. Neural pathways have been rewired to interpret the machine's senses as its own senses, the machine's weapons as its own limbs. Like us, Sethra said. Similar. The principle is the same. A consciousness transplanted from a biological substrate to a mechanical one. But the execution is partial. The brain has been preserved rather than consumed. It still functions as an organic organ. Which means, Sethra followed the logic, that the consciousness inside this machine is still alive. It retains its organic nature, its biological identity, its soul, if such a thing exists. The word hung in the air, heavy with implications that no Necron would openly acknowledge, but that many privately contemplated. The Necrons had traded their souls for immortality 60 million years ago. It was the foundational tragedy of their existence, the wound that the biotransference had inflicted. They were immortal, powerful beyond imagining, but they were empty. The spark of consciousness that the Necrontyre had called the soul had been consumed, leaving only cold machinery of thought and phantom memories of emotions that could no longer be felt. And here was a creature that had undergone a similar transformation, but had somehow retained what they had lost. A mind in a machine that was still alive, still feeling, still dreaming, still praying. Seth Ra did not feel kinship. She was incapable of it. But standing in the green-lit darkness of Subvault 12 Gamma, she experienced something that her diagnostic subroutines classified as data incongruence, and that a more poetic consciousness might have called yearning. She filed the sensation away for later analysis and returned to her work. Something changed in the third week of the examination. Seth Ra was conducting a deep spectrum scan of the ward network when she noticed an irregularity in the neural activity readings. The brain, which had been cycling through its slow, repetitive dream patterns with the regularity of a metronome, was accelerating. The neural impulses were firing faster. The patterns were becoming more complex. The dream was intensifying. She checked the stasis system readouts. They were nominal. The chemical balance of the nutrient bath was stable. There was no mechanical explanation for the change. Netef confirmed the observations with a mix of professional interest and what might have been concern. The consciousness is becoming more active. Neural pathways that were dormant are firing. Synaptic connections are reforming. It is as if the brain is preparing itself for something. Waking, possibly. Or responding to an external stimulus. The stasis systems should prevent full consciousness, but they are designed for short-term dormancy, not centuries of continuous operation. The chemical preservatives are degrading. The neural suppressants are losing effectiveness. The brain may simply be overcoming the stasis through natural biological processes. How long before full consciousness? Days, perhaps hours. Organic systems do not follow clean mathematical progressions. Zeth-Ra transmitted a priority communication to the Pharaon. The response came back within seconds. Proceed with caution. Do not engage unless directly threatened. I am convening the court. The Lich Guard shifted from passive surveillance to active readiness. Warscythes hummed to full power. In the corridors beyond, Immortals took up positions at every access point. Our Gauss blasters charged. Deathmarks phased into position in the upper reaches of the vault, their synaptic disintegrators trained on the Dreadnought's sarcophagus. And through it all, the Dreadnought slept on. But its sleep was changing. The Aegis field was growing brighter. The inscriptions on its hull were beginning to glow with increasing intensity, as if the wards were being charged by a power source that was waking from a very long rest. Inside the sarcophagus, Theron Galliard's brain was doing something it had not done in a very long time. It was thinking. Not the slow, circular thoughts of stasis dreams, the repetitive loops of memory that served as a pale substitute for true consciousness. Real thought. Sequential, purposeful, aware. The kind of thought that begins with a question and moves toward an answer. Yeah, the kind of thought a warrior has when he wakes in an unfamiliar place and realizes that something is very wrong. The first thing Galliard became aware of was the silence. Not the silence of the stasis cycle, which was a void so complete that consciousness itself dissolved. This was different. A waiting silence. The silence of a place where sound could exist, but chose not to. Where the air seemed to be holding its breath. The second thing was the cold. Not the controlled chill of the sarcophagus's climate system. This cold was ancient, deliberate. It seeped through the walls with a patience that spoke of geological timescales. The third thing was the presence. Galliard had spent over 300 years as a Grey Knight before interment, and over 400 more as a Dreadnought. In that time, yet he had developed psychic sensitivity far beyond the already formidable abilities of his chapter. He could sense demons from across a battlefield. He could detect the taint of chaos in a single corrupted soul among thousands. He could feel the pulse of the warp like a second heartbeat. What he sensed now was none of those things. It was not demonic. It was not chaos. It was something that existed entirely within the material universe, that had no connection to the warp at all, but that was nonetheless vast and ancient and powerful beyond anything he had previously encountered. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff and looking into a darkness so deep it seemed bottomless. Like pressing your hand against a wall and feeling, through the stone, as the vibration of machinery so massive and so old that age itself seemed inadequate to describe it. Like hearing silence so absolute it became a sound, a deep subsonic hum below the threshold of human perception. It was a tomb. He was in a tomb, and the things that inhabited it were not dead. They were sleeping, and they were beginning to wake. His combat training took over. He assessed his situation with methodical precision. Sarcophagus intact, life support functional, neural interfaces operational, power systems on emergency reserves, enough for basic functions but not weapons or locomotion. Psychic abilities suppressed by stasis but stirring as consciousness cleared. He could not see. Optical sensors were offline, but he could sense. The Aegis was not merely technological, it was a psychic organ, and an extension of his mind that perceived the world through the lens of the warp. And through the Aegis, Galliard could feel the shapes of the beings around him. They were cold, cold in a way that went beyond temperature, cold in the way that the absence of something fundamental is cold. He could sense their forms, mechanical and precise, arranged in patterns speaking of military discipline. He could sense their awareness, sharp and focused, and he could sense the void at their core, the place where a soul should have been and was not. He knew what they were. Every Grey Knight was trained in identification of the galaxy's threats, and the Necrons occupied a unique and troubling place in that education. They were not demons. They were not heretics. They were remnants of a civilization that had traded its soul for immortality and then spent 60 million years regretting the bargain. And he was in their house. The fear Galliard felt was not conventional fear. He had faced greater demons in single combat. He had walked through warp storms. He had endured 400 years of entombment. What he felt was the fear of the unknown, the cold recognition that he was in a situation for which his training had not prepared him. He did the only thing he could do. He prayed. Not the desperate prayer of a man seeking rescue. Not the angry prayer of a warrior demanding vengeance. He prayed the prayer of a grey knight, the prayer that every brother learned in his first days on Titan. The words formed in his mind, silent and intense, in each carrying the weight of 10,000 years of unbroken tradition. I am the hammer. I am the sword in his hand. I am the tip of his spear. I am the mail about his fist. I am the bane of his foes, and the warding eye that finds them. I am the Emperor's will made manifest. The Aegis field pulsed. The wards flared with sudden, brilliant intensity, flooding the subvault with silver-white light that clashed violently with the green glow of the Necron power grid. The hexagrammic inscriptions blazed like scripture written in starfire, each symbol projecting its meaning into the surrounding space with psychic force that made the very air ripple and distort. The Lich Guard recoiled, not from fear. Necrons did not feel fear, but from the sheer physical force of the psychic discharge, all which struck their necrodermis bodies like a hammer blow and sent their sensor arrays into paroxysms of contradictory data. The Deathmarks lost their targeting locks, weapons swinging wildly as psychic interference scrambled their systems. The Canoptech scarabs scattered in all directions. Seth Ra received the full force of the shockwave. It struck her like a wall of light, driving her sensor arrays to maximum capacity and beyond. She saw things, not hallucinations, impressions. A silver moon orbiting a striped giant planet. A fortress of basalt carved into the surface. Thousands of warriors in silver armor, minds blazing with psychic fire. A golden figure on a golden throne, dying and yet not dead, sustaining 1,000,000 worlds through sheer force of will. The vision lasted less than a second. Then her diagnostic subroutines purged the alien data and restored normal operations. The Dreadnought was awake, not fully. Locomotion offline, weapons unpowered. But the optical sensors had activated, 2 points of blue-white light blazing in the faceplate like twin stars. The Aegis field was at full strength, a dome of shimmering silver energy pushing back the tomb's green glow, like daylight dispelling shadow. And from within, the Dreadnought came a sound that no one in the sub-vault had heard in 60 million years. A voice, a human voice, deep, resonant, distorted by mechanical speakers, but unmistakably alive. In the name of the Emperor of mankind, and by the authority vested in me by the Ordo Malleus of the Holy Inquisition, I am brother Captain Theron Galliard of the Grey Knights, Chapter 666 of the Adeptus Astartes. All identify yourselves. The words echoed through the subvault, bouncing off walls that had not heard organic speech since before the formation of Earth's moon. The Lich Guard held position, war scythes raised. The Deathmarks reacquired their targets. And in the grand processional, Ketep leaned forward on his command throne and spoke a single word. Interesting. What followed was perhaps the strangest diplomatic encounter in the history of either species. Though calling it diplomacy might be generous, it was more like two very dangerous predators circling each other in a confined space, each aware the other could inflict serious damage, each looking for advantage. Galliard had no illusions about his tactical position. He was immobilized, unarmed, deep inside enemy territory, surrounded by vastly superior forces. At his Aegis field provided some protection, but was draining his depleted reserves at an alarming rate. He could maintain it for hours, perhaps days, before his reactor ran dry. But he was a Grey Knight, and Grey Knights do not surrender. They do not negotiate from positions of weakness. They serve the Emperor, and the Emperor's authority is absolute. So Galliad held his ground, maintained his defenses, and projected an aura of calm authority that was, under the circumstances, nothing short of heroic. "You are in a Necron tomb world," came the reply, and Galliad was surprised to hear it in Low Gothic, the common language of the Imperium. The pronunciation was strange, vowels too flat, consonants too sharp, as if the speaker had learned the language from text rather than conversation, but comprehensible. Or, "I am Cryptek Seth Ra of the Saracon dynasty. You are in Sub-Vault 12 Gamma of the tomb world designated Vereth Secundus. You have been here for approximately 427 of your standard years." 427 years. Longer than he had been a flesh and blood warrior. His brothers on the Sword of Purity, assuming any had survived, would be long dead. The chapter would have written him off. No one was coming. "How do you know my language?" "Your machine's data systems contain extensive linguistic files. You examined my technology." "Extensively." Silence stretched between them. Galliad's psychic senses probed the Necron's consciousness, searching for intent, aggression, malice. What he found was unexpected. There was no malice, no hatred. There was curiosity, vast and cold and methodical. There was calculation, strategic assessment he recognized from his own military training. And there was something else, something his psychic senses could barely detect, a faint flickering beneath layers of mechanical cognition. It was not emotion. Necrons did not feel emotion. Every briefing had been emphatic on this point. But as Galliad probed deeper, he found something that challenged that certainty. Like finding a footprint on a beach everyone said was deserted. Evidence of something that had been there, that might still be there. "What do you want?" he asked. "Information. Understanding. Your technology incorporates principles I have not encountered before. The integration of psychic energy into mechanical systems is particularly noteworthy. We do not have this capability. I am not a specimen to be studied. No. You are a warrior, trapped in a situation not of your making, surrounded by forces you cannot overcome, and yet you show no sign of capitulation. This is also noteworthy. I am a Grey Knight. We are trained for situations that other warriors cannot imagine. So I am learning." Another silence. Galliad took a different approach. "You say I have been here for 427 years. My chapter will not be coming for me. I have no strategic value as a hostage. That assessment may be premature. We know little about the current galaxy. Then let me offer a different calculation. I am a Grey Knight. My chapter's existence is a closely guarded secret. Those who learn of us without authorization are dealt with accordingly. By examining my technology, you have placed yourselves in a position that my superiors would consider unacceptable. Are you threatening us? I am informing you. I am also informing you that I have no desire for conflict. I am trapped, and pragmatic enough to recognize it. But I will not be studied like an artifact, and I will not betray the secrets of my chapter. Within those boundaries, I am willing to engage in an exchange of information." Seth Ra had not expected this. Her briefings described Space Marines as fanatical, aggressive, xenophobic. She had anticipated threats, demands, possibly self-destruction. She had not anticipated pragmatism. An exchange. You offer information in return for what? Understanding, Galliad said, turning her own word back on her. I want to know where I am, what year it is, what has happened to the Imperium. And I want to know about you, about your people, about this tomb, about the beings who have kept me alive for 4 centuries when they could have destroyed me at any time. It was audacious. A lone human, trapped and helpless, negotiating with one of the most powerful civilizations in existence as if he were their equal. Any number of Necron overlords would have responded with immediate force. But Seth Ra was a cryptek, and crypteks think like scientists. A scientist, when presented with a novel phenomenon, does not destroy it. They study it, they engage with it. I will need to consult with the Faerun, of course. In the meantime, I would ask that you reduce the intensity of your psychic field. It is causing significant disruption to our sensor arrays. The field is autonomic, it responds to perceived threats. I reduce the number of weapons pointed at me, and the field will diminish proportionally. Seth Ra transmitted a command to the Lich Guard, instructing them to lower their war scythes from combat stance to passive guard. The change was subtle but unmistakable. Within the Dreadnought, Galliard felt the tension decrease by a fraction. His Aegis field responded, dimming slightly. It was still active, still ready to flare at the first sign of aggression, but no longer screaming defiance into the darkness. It was a beginning, not trust, something adjacent to trust, something that might grow into something both sides could work with. Days passed. The exchange proceeded slowly, as all meaningful communication does between species, with no common frame of reference. Seth Ra's linguistic algorithms grew more sophisticated with each conversation. Galliard proved articulate and insightful, his centuries of experience giving him breadth of perspective that repeatedly surprised his Necron counterpart. They spoke about technology. Galliard described imperial engineering, the fusion of science and faith that characterized the Mechanicus approach, the concept of machine spirits. Seth Ra listened with attentive skepticism. The idea that machines could possess spirits was antithetical to her experience, but she could not deny the empirical evidence. The wards worked. The prayers generated measurable energy. They spoke about history. Galliard described the Imperium in broad strokes, careful to omit sensitive details. Seth Ra offered carefully redacted accounts of Necron history, the war in heaven, the biotransference, the great sleep. She was selective but not dishonest. But it was the personal conversations that proved most revealing, conversations that emerged organically from the silences between structured exchanges. "You said your people traded their flesh for metal," Galliard said one day, "that they gave up their organic bodies for immortality." "Yes, the biotransference was our bargain with the Citan. Our flesh was consumed, our consciousness was transferred to necrodermis bodies. And you lost something in the exchange." "We lost everything. Our emotions, our creativity, our capacity for connection. The Necrontyre were a people of great passion. We felt deeply and lived intensely. The biotransference took all of that and left only the structure, the architecture of thought without the content of feeling." "Then how do you know what you lost? If you cannot feel, how do you know what feeling was?" It took Seth Ra several seconds to formulate a response. An eternity for a Necron consciousness. "We remember, not the feelings themselves, but we remember having them. We remember that once, a sunset could make us weep, that music could make our hearts soar, that another being's touch could fill us with warmth that had nothing to do with thermal energy. We remember these things the way a blind person remembers color. We know it existed. We know what it meant. But we cannot experience it. We can only point to the space where it used to be and say, there is where my soul was, before they took it away." Galliard was silent for a long time. His Aegis field dimmed, not from reduced threat, but from something more fundamental, and a shift in psychic energies suggesting an emotional response too complex and private to share. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of formal authority, and replaced with something raw and very old. "I understand, more than you might think. You are alive, you feel. How can you understand losing that connection?" "Because I am losing it. Slowly, century by century. The stasis systems preserve my brain, but cannot preserve everything it contains. Memories fade, emotions become less immediate, less real. My mentor's face on Titan, I cannot remember it. My mother's voice, gone centuries ago. The taste of food, the warmth of sunlight, the pleasure of breathing fresh air. These are concepts now, not experiences." He paused. "I am becoming what you describe. Not all at once, but gradually, like a shore eroding under the tide. But the machine preserves my consciousness, but cannot preserve my humanity. That I must preserve myself. Through will, through faith, through the stubborn refusal to let go of what makes me more than a weapon with thoughts. Sethra processed this longer than she should have needed to. Her diagnostic subroutines kept flagging it as data incongruence, a mismatch between her programming's assertion that she was incapable of empathy and the observable fact that she was experiencing something very much like it. You fight to remain yourself. Every day, every hour, every time I wake and feel a little less, I fight. I pray. I remember. I choose to be Theron Galliard rather than Dreadnought serial number whatever. I choose to be a man rather than a machine. And you believe this is possible? That consciousness can maintain its nature despite losing the biological substrate. I believe it is necessary. Whether it is possible is a question I answer by continuing to do it. Sethra said nothing for a long time. When she spoke, her voice carried undertones her diagnostics would have classified as impossible. Your species is younger than ours by 60 million years. Your technology is crude. And yet in this one struggle, you are more advanced than we are. I would not call it advancement. Then what? Stubbornness. Bloody-minded, irrational, human stubbornness. The refusal to accept what the universe tells you that you must become. We lost that quality when we lost our flesh. With respect, Cryptek, I do not think you did. I think you stopped looking for it. You decided 60 million years ago that it was gone. And in deciding, you made it so. You programmed yourselves to be incapable of feeling, then pointed to the absence as proof, a self-fulfilling prophecy. You suggest we could reclaim what we lost? I suggest you consider the possibility that you never lost it entirely, that somewhere beneath the programming and the protocols and 60 million years of habit, there is still a spark. A spark you have been calling a malfunction every time it tries to remind you it exists. Sethra's sensor arrays flickered. Diagnostic warnings cascaded. Data incongruence, processing anomaly, unclassifiable input. She ignored them all. You are a very unusual warrior, Brother Captain Galliard. And you are a very unusual Cryptek, Sethra. For the first time in 60 million years, the sound of something that was not quite laughter echoed through the corridors of the tomb of Verath Secundus. Mechanical and organic, ancient and new. The Canoptek scarabs paused, confused. The Lich Guard found no threat to engage. In the Grand Processional, Ketep tilted his head at an angle no one could interpret. And in the deep places of the tomb, something shifted. Not in the machinery, not in the power grid, something deeper. Something the Necrons had forgotten they possessed, and that a single human warrior had just reminded them existed. The crisis, when it came, arrived from a direction neither side had anticipated. Anchoret's long-range sensors detected something approaching the Verath system. It was not human, Necron, Aeldari, or Orc. The databases eventually classified it as an extragalactic anomaly. A fleet of biological ships, vast and terrible, moving through the void with mindless hunger. Tyranids, a splinter fleet separated from a larger hive fleet by cosmic eddies. Small by Tyranid standards, which still meant large enough to strip a planet of all biological matter in weeks. And it was heading directly for Verath Secundus. The irony was not lost on anyone. The tomb world had no biological life to offer. Its surface was barren, atmosphere thin. Under normal circumstances, the splinter fleet would have passed by. But there was biological life on Verath Secundus now. One brain, suspended in a nutrient bath, broadcasting through the Aegis field's psychic emanations like a signal fire in the darkness. Galliard realized it first. His psychic senses detected the approaching hive mind as a pressure on the edge of his consciousness. A vast alien hunger that made even the Necron tomb seem warm by comparison. "There is something coming," he said with urgency that cut through the measured pace of conversation. "Something large, something hungry, and it is coming for me." The warning galvanized the court. Ketep's military instincts snapped to full alert. Thotep received the mobilization order he had been waiting for with something his subordinates might have mistaken for satisfaction. "Wake the legions. All of them. The tomb of Verath Secundus goes to war." The awakening of a Necron dynasty's full military strength is a sight few witnesses survive to describe. From stasis crypts lining endless corridors, thousands of warriors rose simultaneously, necrodermis humming with restored power, Gauss flayers cycling to full charge with a collective whine resonating through the tomb like a funeral dirge. Immortals emerged from deeper crypts, their heavier weapons marking them as elite infantry, destroyers activated in maintenance bays, hover platforms lifting them with silent efficiency, ghost arcs powered up and moved into formation. Doomsday arcs carrying cannons that could level city blocks took positions at the exits. Annihilation barges, Tesla destructors crackling with contained lightning, formed screening elements, and from the deepest vault rose the monolith, a massive floating fortress of living metal, its surface amplifying the tomb's power grid 1,000-fold. The dynasty's ultimate weapon, capable of transporting troops through dimensional portals and projecting devastating firepower. As the dynasty mobilized, something unexpected happened in Subvault 12 Gamma. Galliard, sensing the hive mind and understanding the threat, made a decision that would have stunned his chapter's leadership. Release me. Restore power to my systems. Let me fight. You are asking us to arm a prisoner. I am asking you to accept an ally. The Tyranids will not distinguish between Necron and human. My psychic abilities are a weapon you do not possess. If you release me, I can fight alongside your warriors. After the battle, we can renegotiate. And during the battle? How do we know you will not turn against us? You do not. You have only my word, the word of a Grey Knight, considered binding unto death and beyond. Take it or leave it, but decide quickly. Seth Ra relayed the offer. The court erupted in competing analyses. Thotep argued against, insisting the human was untrustworthy and his destruction would remove the psychic beacon. Anchoret argued for, calculating the Grey Knight's combat capabilities as a significant force multiplier. Seth Ra stated only that her psychological analysis suggested the promise was genuine. Ketep listened, processed, decided. Release the Grey Knight. Restore his weapons. Let him fight. The Lich Guard stepped back. Cassette connected a Necron power conduit to the Dreadnought's reactor, flooding its systems with energy from the tomb's own grid. Galliard felt power surge through his body for the first time in centuries. Weapons cycling to full charge. Locomotion systems activating. Servo motors engaging. For the first time in 427 years, he took a step. The floor shook. The Lich Guard steadied themselves. Mars Seth Ra's form bobbed slightly. He took another step, and another. The massive frame moved through the subvault, with ponderous grace speaking of immense power under precise control. His optical sensors swept the chamber, taking in Necron warriors, green-lit corridors, the vast ancient tomb that had been his prison and was now his staging ground. He flexed his nemesis Doomfist, its energy field activated with a crack of displaced air, wreathing the massive weapon in silver light. Where do you want me? And Nemesaur Thotep, who had argued most vehemently for destruction, answered with the pragmatism of a commander facing extinction. At the front. The Tyranids made planetfall with characteristic efficiency. Mycetic spores rained from the sky like biological meteorites, each carrying bioforms that clawed free and moved toward the psychic signal. Gaunts and Hormagaunts formed the leading edge, a tide of chitin and claws. Warriors and Carnifexes followed, providing heavier capabilities, and the hive ships continued disgorging their cargo, an endless stream of biological weapons raining on a world that had nothing to offer except one human brain. They were met by the full might of the Saracon dynasty. The tomb's surface defenses activated with Necron mines behind them, directing Gauss projectors with precision the automated systems could not match. Beams of green energy lanced across the desert, stripping Tyranid bioforms to component atoms. Doomsday cannons fired in coordinated volleys, reducing dozens of smaller bioforms to biological mist, and staggering the larger ones. But the Tyranids kept coming. They always did. That was their fundamental horror. They did not break, retreat, or hesitate. They simply advanced, an endless tide directed by a consciousness that saw individuals as expendable. The Necrons advanced to meet them, and for the first time in the Tomb World's history, the dynasty's legions marched in formation across the surface. Thousands of skeletal metal warriors moving in perfect synchronization, ghost flayers lighting the twilight sky with constant green fire. Immortals held the center. Destroyers ranged the flanks at high speed, and in the very center of the line, towering over the ranks surrounding him, walked the Grey Knight's Dreadnought. Galliard fought with the fury of a warrior imprisoned for over 4 centuries and finally freed. His assault cannon spoke its thunder, and explosive shells tearing through Tyranid bioforms with violence that made the precise Gauss fire seem almost polite. His nemesis Doomfist crushed, smashed, and pulverized anything that got close, its psychic energy field incinerating Tyranid flesh on contact and disrupting synaptic links connecting smaller bioforms to the hive mind. But it was his psychic abilities that made the greatest impact. The Aegis field, fully powered and fueled by a consciousness that had spent 4 centuries building psychic energy, expanded outward in a wave of silver light. Where the field touched Tyranid bioforms, they faltered. The anti-warp energy disrupted the synaptic network connecting them to the hive mind. For precious seconds, smaller bioforms simply stopped. Neural impulses scrambled, bodies motionless as Gorsefire cut them down. It was not decisive. The hive mind was vast, but it was significant. It created gaps that the Necrons exploited with ruthless efficiency, concentrating firepower on disrupted sections and cutting deep before the hive mind could re-establish control. The battle raged for hours. Tyranid reinforcements continued pouring from the sky, but the Necrons had 2 advantages the Tyranids could not overcome. First was their reanimation protocols. When a Necron warrior fell, its body wreathed in emerald light as self-repair systems activated, knitting damaged necrodermis and restoring shattered limbs. The Tyranids could not eat what they could not keep dead, and the Necrons were spectacularly difficult to keep dead. Second was Galliard himself. His psychic disruption interfered with the hive mind's ability to coordinate, forcing it to rely on autonomous instincts rather than centralized intelligence. Without coordination, the swarm became disjointed, attacks losing the synchronized precision that made them devastating. When the last bioform fell, the surface of Verath Secundus was a landscape of devastation. Acidic Tyranid blood had etched deep channels into the desert. Pools of dissolved biomass steamed in the thin atmosphere. And standing in the midst of it all, surrounded by Necron warriors bearing scars of 100 repairs, was the Grey Knight's Dreadnought. His chassis was scored and pitted, ceramite cracked in a dozen places. His assault cannon was dry, ammunition expended. His nemesis Doomfist was coated in dissolving remains of a Tyranid warrior prime that had been introduced fatally to the concept of psychically charged adamantium. But his Aegis field still shone, battered, dimmed, running on fumes, but active, still protecting, still radiating the faith of a warrior who had been fighting the Emperor's enemies for over 700 years and was not about to stop. Galliard stood amid the carnage and silence and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not since the demon world that had earned his reputation. Not since the day he had taken his oaths on Titan. He felt alive. The aftermath of the battle was, in many ways, more remarkable than the battle itself. Necron warriors stood motionless across the blasted landscape, Gauss flayers still humming with residual charge. Their reanimation protocols had restored virtually every casualty. Living metal bodies that had been torn apart, dissolved by acid, or crushed by Carnifex talons, were now reassembled and functional, standing in the same formation positions they had held at the start of the engagement. To a human observer, it would have seemed like nothing had happened. The same army that marched out had marched back. not a single permanent loss. But the Necrons knew differently. Each reanimation left traces. Microfractures in necrodermis that would take centuries of self-repair to fully heal. Slight misalignments in quantum circuitry that degraded processing speed by fractions of a percent. Energy reserves depleted and slowly recharging. They had won, but the cost was written in their bodies in a language only they could read. Galliard was in worse shape. His ceramite armor was cracked in 17 places. His assault cannon had expended its entire ammunition supply and would need complete reloading from stores that did not exist on this world. His nemesis Doomfist was functional, but operating at 60% efficiency, its power field generator strained by the punishment it had dealt and received. His reactor was running at dangerously low levels, barely enough to maintain life support and basic locomotion. But he was standing, and the Aegis was still glowing, faint and steady, like the last ember of a dying fire. Nemesor Thotep approached the Dreadnought across a field of dissolving Tyranid remains. The Necron commander had fought with distinction during the battle, his war scythe carving through bioforms with a mechanical precision that spoke of reflexes honed over millennia. And he had watched the Grey Knight fight with the clinical eye of a professional soldier assessing a fellow warrior, and what he had seen had forced him to revise several of his assumptions. "You fought well, human," Thotep said. The words were not warm. Necrons did not do warm, but they carried a weight of professional acknowledgement that, in Necron culture, was the equivalent of effusive praise. "As did your warriors, Nemesor. Your tactical coordination was impressive. The flanking maneuver with the destroyers in the third hour was particularly effective." Thotep's optical sensors brightened fractionally. The human had noticed. More than noticed, he had understood the tactical thinking behind the movement. This was not the xenophobic fanatic that Thotep's briefings had prepared him for. This was a fellow commander speaking a shared language of warfare. "The psychic disruption you provided was decisive," Thotep said, each word sounding like it was being extracted under duress. Without it, the synapse network would have maintained coordination throughout the engagement. Our casualties would have been significantly higher. The Tyranids are a shared enemy. There is no honor in fighting alone when survival requires cooperation. Thotep processed this. His combat subroutines had a clear recommendation, which was to destroy the human now that the threat was eliminated and his usefulness concluded. But something else was operating alongside those subroutines, something older and less easily categorized. It might have been respect. It might have been the ghost of an emotion that the biotransference had not entirely consumed. "I have recommended to the Pharaon that you be permitted to remain functional," Thotep said. "This recommendation is based entirely on tactical considerations." "Of course," Galliard replied, and if there was amusement in his mechanical voice, it was too subtle for Necron audio processing to detect. The court reconvened in the Grand Processional, and this time the Grey Knight's Dreadnought was present, not as a subject of examination, not as a prisoner under guard. He had been invited as, for lack of a better term, a guest. The sight was extraordinary by any standard. Thousands of Necron nobles arranged in their hierarchical positions, their necrodermis bodies gleaming with the green light of the tomb's power grid. Lichguards standing at attention along the central aisle, cryptex hovering in their designated alcoves. And at the end of the processional, standing before the Pharaon's command throne, a 4-meter-tall Grey Knight's Dreadnought, bearing the scars of a battle fought alongside the very beings who had held him captive for centuries. Ketep's death mask displayed a pattern that none of his courtiers had seen before. It was not in any standard configuration. The living metal of his face was cycling through expressions too quickly to categorize, as if his consciousness was processing something that his protocols had no established response for. "Brother, Captain Galliard," the Pharaon said, "you have rendered service to the Saracon dynasty. The protocols of the Necrontyre, which predate our current form by epochs beyond counting, are clear on how such service must be acknowledged." He paused. The court was utterly silent. Or, in the time before the biotransference, when the Necrontyre were a people of flesh and passion, and all the messy complications that organic existence entails, there existed a code of conduct between warriors. It was called the Feruket, the warrior's acknowledgement. When an enemy fought with honor alongside a Necron host, when an adversary set aside enmity to face a common threat, the Feruket required that the debt be recognized. Another pause. Ketep's mask settled into something that might have been solemnity. This code has not been invoked in 60 million years. Many would say it is obsolete, that the beings we have become have no use for such relics of organic sentimentality. But I am the pharaoh of the Saracon dynasty, and I remember, even if imperfectly, the traditions that defined my people before the machines consumed us. He rose from his command throne. The Lich Guard tensed. This was not protocol. Pharaohs did not rise for anyone. Pharaohs sat on thrones, and the galaxy arranged itself accordingly. But Ketep rose, and he descended the steps of his dais, and he walked across the grand processional until he stood before the Grey Knight's Dreadnought, his ornate form dwarfed by the massive war machine, but his presence filling the chamber with an authority that had nothing to do with physical size. I invoke the Feruket. You are acknowledged, brother Captain Galed. Your valor is recorded, your service is honored, and your freedom is granted. The words echoed through the processional. Our Necron nobles who had not experienced surprise in 60 million years found their cognitive processes stuttering as they attempted to process what they had just witnessed. My freedom, Galliard said carefully. You mean I am free to leave? I mean that you are no longer a captive of the Saracon dynasty. You are a guest, and when the means can be arranged, you will be permitted to depart this world and return to your own people. Why? The question was blunt, and Ketep's mask flickered through several configurations before settling on something that looked remarkably like honesty. Because you reminded me of something I had forgotten. Something that 60 million years of mechanical existence had buried so deep, I believed it was gone forever. What? That honor is not a protocol. It is a choice. And that choice is what separates a warrior from a weapon. The silence that followed was the loudest sound in the tomb. The days that followed the Pharaoh's declaration were unlike anything either species had experienced. The formal hostility that had defined their initial interactions gave way to something more complex and harder to categorize. It was not friendship exactly. The cultural and biological gulf between them was too vast for friendship in any conventional sense. But it was recognition. An acknowledgement that beneath the ceramite and the necrodermis, beneath the prayers and the protocols, there existed a shared understanding of what it meant to be a consciousness navigating a universe that seemed determined to strip that consciousness of everything that made it meaningful. Seth Ra continued her conversations with Galliard, but the tone had shifted. Where before she had approached him as a subject of study, now she engaged with him as something closer to a colleague. The questions she asked were no longer purely analytical. They probed at something deeper, something her diagnostic subroutines kept flagging as irrelevant, but that she found impossible to ignore. Tell me about faith, she said one day. Not the mechanics of psychic channeling, the experience of it. What does it feel like to believe? Galliard considered the question carefully. It was not the kind of question he had ever been asked to answer. Faith, among the Grey Knights, was not something you described. It was something you lived. It was the bedrock upon which everything else was built. So fundamental that articulating it felt like trying to describe the taste of water to someone who had never been thirsty. It feels like certainty, he said after a long pause. Not intellectual certainty, which is fragile and easily shaken. Something deeper, something that lives in the bones, in the blood, in whatever part of me still remembers what it was to have bones and blood. It is the knowledge that there is meaning in the universe, that my suffering has purpose, that my existence, even in this diminished form, serves something greater than myself. And this certainty persists despite evidence to the contrary, despite centuries of isolation and degradation. because of them. Faith that is never tested is merely opinion. Faith that survives the furnace is something stronger. Every century I spend in this sarcophagus, every memory I lose, every piece of my humanity that erodes away, each of these tests my faith, and each time it holds. Not because I am strong, because the thing I have faith in is strong. The Emperor. The Emperor. The Imperium. The idea that humanity, for all its failings and cruelties and blind spots, is worth protecting, worth fighting for, worth enduring this half-existence to preserve. Even though the Imperium does not know you are here, even though it may never know, that is precisely the point. Faith is not transactional. I do not serve the Emperor because I expect reward or recognition. I serve because service itself is the reward. The act of choosing to continue, to remain faithful, to preserve my humanity against all forces that seek to destroy it. That act gives my existence meaning. Without it, and I would be exactly what Nemes-Thotep accused me of being, a weapon with no purpose beyond destruction. Seth-Ra was quiet for a long time. Her sensor arrays dimmed to their lowest setting, the Necron equivalent of closing one's eyes in contemplation. The Necron Tyre had faith once, she said eventually, before the biotransference. We worshipped the stars. We believed that the universe was alive with meaning and purpose, that our suffering under the radiation of our dying sun was a trial that would ultimately be rewarded. We looked to the heavens and saw gods. The Satan, star gods. We thought they would save us. We thought the biotransference would be a gift, eternal life in bodies that did not age, did not sicken, did not feel the burning radiation that was killing our species. We believed, Brother Captain. We had faith. And that faith was betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. The Satan consumed your souls. They consumed everything. Our flesh, our feelings, our capacity for joy and sorrow and love and hate. They left us as you see us now. Machines that remember being alive. Ghosts that haunt their own bodies. We trusted the gods, and the gods ate us. And you concluded that faith itself was the problem. What else could we conclude? We believed, and belief destroyed us. Logic dictated that belief itself was the enemy, that the only safe course was to trust nothing, feel nothing, expect nothing, to reduce existence to calculations and protocols, and the cold comfort of knowing that if nothing matters, nothing can hurt. But something does hurt. I can sense it, even through your null field. There is something in you that aches, Seth-Ra. Something that all the protocols in the galaxy cannot quite silence. Data incongruence, a processing anomaly, nothing more. If you say so. I do say so. But she did not leave, and the silence between them was not empty. It was full of things that neither of them could say, things that bridged 60 million years, and the gulf between species, and the fundamental divide between a consciousness that clung to its humanity and one that had been told its humanity was gone. In the weeks that followed, Galliard noticed changes in the Necrons around him. Small things, subtle things, the kind of things that a being with 7 centuries of experience reading people, even people made of living metal, could not fail to observe. The Lich Guard who stood watch over him had developed individual patterns. One always positioned himself slightly closer than protocol required, his optical sensors tracking Galliard's movements with attention that went beyond security assessment. Another had taken to polishing his war scythe during quiet periods, running a maintenance cloth over the already flawless surface with a repetitive motion suggesting something beyond mechanical maintenance, something meditative. The warriors who passed through the corridors near his chamber had begun to slow as they walked by. Necron warriors were supposed to be the least individual of all Necron forms, their consciousness stripped down to basic combat functions. But something about the Grey Knight's presence seemed to snag their attention, like a current catching a leaf. They would pause for a fraction of a second, their sensor arrays sweeping over the Dreadnought's scarred hull and glowing wards, before moving on. It was not curiosity, exactly. It was more like recognition, as if something in their degraded consciousness remembered what it was to be in the presence of something alive. Even Thotep had changed. The Nemesaur still maintained his rigid military bearing, still approached every situation with tactical efficiency. But he had taken to visiting Galliad during the quiet hours when the tomb's power grid cycled through its maintenance routines. He would stand before the Dreadnought in silence for minutes at a time, his war scythe resting at his side, his optical sensors fixed on some middle distance that existed only in whatever passed for a Necron's inner world. One night, if the concept of night had any meaning in a subterranean tomb, our Thotep broke his customary silence. "I was a father," he said. The words came out flat and unadorned, stripped of any emotional content by his mechanical voice. But the very fact that he spoke them carried more weight than any inflection could have provided. "Before the biotransference, I had a son. His name was Amenhotep. He was 7 years old when we went into the furnaces." Galliad said nothing. He had learned that silence was sometimes the most powerful form of communication, that the space between words could contain more meaning than the words themselves. "I cannot remember his face," Thotep continued. "I know the data, height, weight, genetic profile. These are stored in my memory banks with perfect fidelity. But the way he looked when he smiled, the sound of his laughter, the feeling of his hand in mine as we walked through the gardens of our estate on the homeworld, these things are gone, erased by the biotransference or degraded by the Great Sleep until they are nothing but null values in a database. But you remember that they existed. I remember that they mattered. I remember that once there was something in the universe more important to me than tactical efficiency and hierarchical protocol. Something that made the radiation sickness and the shortened lifespan and all the suffering of Necrontire existence bearable. And I remember that the Citan took it from me along with everything else. And you are angry." Thotep's optical sensors flared. "Necrons do not feel anger. No, but if they did, you would be furious, not at the Citan, at yourself, for letting them take your son's smile away." The silence that followed lasted a very long time. When Thotep finally spoke, his mechanical voice carried something that his diagnostic subroutines could not classify, and that he chose not to examine too closely. "How do you endure it? The knowledge that you are losing what matters most." "I do not endure it. I fight it. Every single day. I take the memories I have left, and I hold them so tightly that the universe itself would have to pry them from my mind. And when a memory fades despite my best efforts, I mourn it. I grieve for it, the way you would grieve for a fallen comrade. And then I hold the remaining ones even tighter." That sounds exhausting. It is the most exhausting thing I have ever done. Harder than any battle, harder than the entombment itself. But the alternative is to become what you have become. And I say that with no disrespect, Nemesaur. You are a formidable warrior and a capable commander, but you are less than what you were, and knowing that and accepting it seems to me to be the worst defeat of all. Thotep was silent again, but when he left, his stride was different, slightly less mechanical, slightly more deliberate, as if each step was a choice rather than a programmed response. Ketep had been monitoring these interactions through the tomb's surveillance network, not out of suspicion, out of fascination. The Pharaon found himself drawn to the unfolding dynamic between his subjects and the alien warrior with an intensity that his protocols could not explain. The Grey Knight was doing something to his dynasty, nothing aggressive, nothing threatening, but he was simply being what he was. A consciousness that refused to surrender its essential nature despite overwhelming pressure to do so, and his refusal was proving contagious. Reports were coming in from across the tomb of minor anomalies in Necron behavior. A warrior in the 4th cohort had been observed standing before a wall inscription for 3 hours. Its sensor arrays focused on text that described a battle from the war in heaven. It had no reason to do this. Warriors did not contemplate history, but it stood there nonetheless. A lord in the Eastern Wing had requested access to the dynasty's cultural archives. specifically records of Necron music. There had been no music in Necron society since the biotransference. There was no mechanism for appreciation and no purpose for creation. But the Lord had made the request through proper channels, citing a desire to verify historical data. No one believed that was the real reason. And in her workshop, Zethra had begun a project that she had not reported through official channels. She was designing a device, a small one by Necron standards, no larger than a human hand. Its purpose was to capture and store psychic emanations, not for analysis, but for preservation. She told herself it was a research tool, that the ability to record and replay psychic energy signatures had obvious intelligence applications. But the specific signature she was calibrating it to capture was the one generated by a Grey Knight's Dreadnought during prayer. The pattern that her diagnostic subroutines classified as data incongruence, the pattern that, yes, if she was being honest with herself in a way she had not been for 60 million years, made her feel something. The tomb of Vareth Secundus was changing, not in its physical structure, not in its hierarchical organization, not in any way that could be measured by instruments or quantified by protocols. It was changing in the spaces between the measurements, in the silences between the commands, in the moments when individual Necrons paused for a fraction of a second longer than efficiency required and wondered why. A single human warrior, entombed in a machine that was itself a kind of prison, was reminding an entire civilization of something it had spent 60 million years trying to forget, that it had once been alive. News of the events on Vareth Secundus would eventually reach other ears. As in the vast network of Necron dynasties scattered across the galaxy, information traveled through channels that had been established during the War in Heaven and maintained by automated systems throughout the Great Sleep. Most of this information was military intelligence, threat assessments, resource surveys, but occasionally, something unusual enough to merit broader attention would propagate through the network like a ripple in a pond. The account of a human war machine found sleeping in a Necron tomb, of a biological consciousness preserved in metal for centuries, of a battle fought alongside alien warriors against a common foe. This was unusual enough to attract attention from several quarters. On Solemnace, in the galleries of the greatest collector the galaxy has ever known, yes, a being of considerable reputation received the intelligence report with interest. Trazyn the Infinite, overlord of Solemnace, archaivist of the prismatic galleries, and self-appointed curator of galactic history, was always interested in unusual specimens. His collection spanned millions of years and millions of worlds, containing everything from preserved battlefields to individual warriors held in perpetual stasis within tesseract labyrinths. He had Imperial guardsmen frozen in mid-charge. He had Aeldari Farseers suspended in psychic amber. He had Orc war bosses trapped in moments of bellowing fury. He had, if the rumors were to be believed, an entire company of ultramarines from the legendary defense of Macragge, though he denied this with the kind of elaborate nonchalance that convinced nobody. And a Grey Knight's Dreadnought that had been sleeping in a Necron tomb for centuries would have been a prize beyond measure. The rarest chapter of Space Marines, one of the rarest configurations of Dreadnought, preserved in one of the most unusual circumstances imaginable. Trazyn could already envision the display case. He could see the lighting, angled to catch the hexagrammic inscriptions at their most dramatic. He could compose the informational plaque in his head, a detailed explanation of the exhibit's significance, written in the 17 languages he considered worthy of his scholarly attention. The plaque would note the unique circumstances of discovery, the unprecedented period of cohabitation between species, the philosophical implications of two very different civilizations arriving at the same solution to the problem of mortality. But even Trazyn recognized that the political implications of attempting to acquire the specimen would be significant. The Saracon dynasty, while diminished by the Great Sleep, was not to be trifled with. Ketep's reputation as a military commander survived in the historical records, even if the Pharaon himself could no longer remember all the details. And the invocation of the Pharaoh-Ket created complications that even Trazyn's legendary diplomatic skills would struggle to navigate. To seize a being who had been granted the warrior's acknowledgement would be a breach of tradition so severe that it could unite otherwise fractious dynasties against him. So instead of dispatching an acquisition team, Trazyn filed the report in his personal archives under specimens of interest and made a note to revisit the matter at a more opportune time. He had time. He always had time. That was the advantage of being immortal. Sooner or later, an opportunity would present itself. It always did. He did, however, send a private message to Seth Ra through encrypted channels, requesting copies of her research data on the Grey Knight's psychic ward network. Purely for academic purposes, of course. The response he received was a politely worded refusal that managed to convey, in the precise language of cryptek-to-cryptek communication, that Seth Ra considered his request to be roughly equivalent to asking a parent to sell their child. Trazyn found this deeply encouraging. A cryptek who responded to a data request with emotion, even buried emotion, was a cryptek who had been changed by whatever she was studying. This made the subject of her study even more valuable. And he added another note to his file and moved on to other matters. The galaxy was vast and full of things worth collecting. Meanwhile, on Vereth Secundus, the question of transport was slowly resolving itself. Ankaret's scouts had identified an Imperial shipping lane approximately 3 months' travel from the Vereth system. If the tomb's lighter craft could be restored to operational status, it would be possible to deposit Galerd in the path of Imperial traffic, where his distress beacon would eventually attract attention. The plan had an elegant simplicity that appealed to Necron sensibilities: clean, efficient, minimal risk of unwanted contact between the dynasty and Imperial forces. The Grey Knight would be found drifting in the void, his sarcophagus broadcasting on Imperial frequencies, and whoever recovered him would have no reason to suspect that Necrons had been involved. But Galliard had concerns about this plan that went beyond logistics. "If I am recovered by Imperial forces," he told Seth Ra during one of their conversations, "I will be examined extensively. The Ordo Malleus does not simply accept the return of a Grey Knight who has been missing for centuries. They will want to know where I have been, what I have seen, what I know." "And you would tell them about us?" "I would have to. The Inquisition has methods of extracting information that make your examinations look gentle by comparison. Psychic probes, chemical interrogation, mnemo-surgical extraction. Even if I wanted to conceal your existence, they would find the truth." "Then you are saying that your return to Imperial space poses a threat to our security?" "I am saying that it is a complication that deserves consideration. Your dynasty is newly awakened and vulnerable. An inquisitorial strike force dispatched to this system could cause significant damage before your defenses are fully restored. Are you suggesting that you remain here?" The question hung between them like a held breath. Galliard's optical sensors dimmed slightly, the Dreadnought equivalent of a thoughtful expression. "I am suggesting that we think carefully about the consequences of my departure. Not just for me, but for your people." It was a remarkable statement from a warrior whose entire existence was defined by service to an Imperium that would classify every being in this tomb as an enemy to be destroyed. Galliard was not betraying his loyalty. He was exercising the judgment that had made him a brother captain, the ability to see beyond immediate objectives to the broader implications of any given action. "There is another option," Seth Ra said, "one that protects both your interests and ours." "I am listening." "The Dolmen Gates can access the Webway, the extra-dimensional network created by the Old Ones during the War in Heaven. The Eldari use it extensively. More recently, Imperial forces have been observed using similar corridors. If we could deposit you within a section of the Webway accessible to Imperial forces, you could be recovered without any trail leading back to Vereth Secundus. The Webway is dangerous for psychically active beings. The corridors are patrolled by things that feed on psychic energy. Your wards would provide protection, and the journey would be brief. The Dolmen Gate in our possession connects to a node approximately 17 standard hours from a gate known to be used by Imperial forces in the Calixis sector. You have mapped the Webway in this region?" We mapped the webway 60 million years ago. It has changed since then, but the primary arterials remain stable, and our dolmen gate technology allows us to force access even to sections the Aeldari have sealed. Galliard processed this. The risks were real, but manageable. His Aegis field, even in its depleted state, would provide significant protection against webway predators. The journey was short enough to be feasible on his remaining power reserves, and the destination, the Calixis sector, was territory he knew well from campaigns fought before his entombment. "It could work," he said. "It will work. I will make certain of it." There was something in her voice that went beyond professional assurance, something that his psychic senses detected as a commitment that ran deeper than duty or protocol. Seth Ra was not simply solving a logistical problem, she was protecting something she valued. And what she valued, Galliard realized with something approaching wonder, was him. Not the weapon, not the specimen, not the tactical asset. Him. Theron Galliard, the man inside the machine. Yet the consciousness that had challenged her assumptions and stirred something in the depths of her mechanical soul that she had spent 60 million years pretending did not exist. "Thank you, Seth Ra. There is no need for gratitude. This arrangement serves the dynasty's strategic interests." "Of course it does." The silence that followed was warm, if silence could be warm. Two beings, separated by species and technology, and 60 million years of history, sharing a moment of connection that neither of them would ever fully acknowledge, but that both would remember for as long as their respective forms of consciousness endured. The preparations for Galliard's departure took several weeks. The Dolmen Gate required calibration, its ancient systems brought online and aligned with current webway geometries. Del Cassette's technomancers worked with focused precision, and Seth Ra herself supervised the energy calculations that would determine the accuracy of the transit. During this time, Galliard continued his conversations with the Necrons who sought him out. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. The Necron would approach with a question framed in neutral, analytical terms. Galliard would answer with a directness that cut through the pretense. And somewhere in the exchange, something would shift. Some door that had been closed for 60 million years would crack open just enough to let a sliver of light through. A Lichguard asked about honor and what it meant to serve a cause greater than oneself. Galliard spoke about the Grey Knight's oaths, about the weight of responsibility and the freedom that came from accepting it. The Lichguard listened with an intensity that went beyond security assessment and, when the conversation ended, returned to his post with a bearing that was subtly but unmistakably more purposeful. A lord asked about beauty and whether it still existed in a galaxy consumed by war. Galliard described a nebula he had once seen from the observation deck of a strike cruiser, a vast cloud of gas and dust lit from within by the birth of new stars. He described the way the colors shifted and blended, blue into violet, into rose, into gold, and how the sight had moved him to silence. The Lord returned to the Eastern Wing, and for the first time since the Awakening, opened the dynasty's artistic archives, not to study them, but simply to look. An immortal, and one of the higher functioning warrior types whose consciousness retained more complexity than the basic warriors, asked about regret. This surprised Galliard. Necrons were not supposed to feel regret, but the immortal spoke with a halting precision that suggested it was navigating emotional territory it had been told was inaccessible. "I remember choosing the biotransference," the immortal said. "I remember believing it was the right decision. I remember the hope that it would save our people. And I remember the moment when I realized it had not saved anything, that it had merely replaced one form of suffering with another. Do you wish you had chosen differently? I do not know. I do not have the capacity for that kind of reflective judgment. I can analyze alternatives and calculate probability matrices, but I cannot feel the weight of a road not taken. Can you not? Because standing here, asking me about regret, suggests that you are feeling exactly that weight, even if your programming tells you otherwise." The immortal's optical sensors flickered, processing, analyzing, confronting a contradiction between what it was told it could not do and the observable fact that it appeared to be doing it. "I have been operational for 63 million years," it said at last. "In that time, I have fought in more battles than I can count. I have been destroyed and rebuilt more times than the records can track. I have served my dynasty with unwavering loyalty through epochs that would break the mind of any organic being. And in all that time, I have never once questioned my existence. Until now. What changed? You did. You are a mind in a machine, like me, but you are more than that. You are a person in a machine. There is a difference, and recognizing that difference has made me wonder whether I, too, was once a person. Whether I might be again." Galliard let the silence hold. Some truths needed space to breathe. "I believe you were," he said finally. "And I believe that the fact you can wonder about it means that some part of that person survived. Damaged, buried, suppressed by 60 million years of programming and protocol, but not destroyed. Not entirely." The immortal did not respond. It simply stood there for a long time, its optical sensors fixed on something that existed beyond the physical boundaries of the corridor. Then it turned and walked away, in its stride carrying a quality that the tomb's surveillance systems could not categorize but that Galliard recognized immediately. It was the walk of someone who had just remembered something important. The final gathering before Galliard's departure was not a formal event. It simply happened. Necrons began converging on the sub-vault where the dolmen gate was being prepared, drawn by something that none of them could articulate, but all of them seemed to feel. Warriors stood in silent ranks along the corridors. Immortals took up positions on the gantries above. Lords and ladies of the court found reasons to inspect the gate's systems that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with the need to be present for something that mattered. Ketep arrived last, as protocol demanded. The pharaoh moved through his assembled subjects with the formal grace of a being who had been raised to command, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of more than ceremony. He was not merely performing a duty. He was participating in a moment that he recognized, even if imperfectly, as significant. The dolmen gate stood at the far end of the sub-vault. It was a massive arch of blackstone, inscribed with equations that predated the existence of every currently living species in the galaxy, except the Necrons themselves. Its surface pulsed with dimensional energies, the boundary between real space and the webway, thinning to a membrane that could be breached with a precisely modulated pulse of chronal energy. Galliard stood before the gate, his massive form dwarfing even the Lich Guard who flanked it. His chassis had been repaired as well as Necron technology could manage, and in some places better than Imperial technology could have achieved. Cassette had replaced damaged power conduits with necrodermis equivalents that interfaced with the Dreadnought's existing systems with unexpected elegance. The ceramite was still cracked in places, its surface bearing scars that would need Grey Knight's facilities to properly mend. But his systems were fully powered, his weapons functional, his Aegis field burning with steady silver light that seemed brighter somehow, more focused, as if the months of meditation and conversation had refined its energies into something purer. He turned to face the assembled Necrons, and for a moment, the sub-vault was utterly silent. Two species, ancient and young, mechanical and organic, soulless and soulful, as sharing a space and a moment that neither would forget. "I'm not good at farewells," Galliard said. "Grey Knights do not practice them. Our doctrine teaches that every parting is temporary, that we will meet again in the Emperor's light. But I do not know if that doctrine applies to this situation. I do not know if I will see any of you again." He paused, his optical sensors sweeping across the assembly with careful deliberation, recording each face, each form, each arrangement of living metal that represented a consciousness older than his entire species. "I came to this tomb by accident, remained by necessity, and leave by choice. What happened between those three events was something I could never have predicted and will never forget. You are not what I was taught you were. You are more. Different from what you were, certainly, Diminished in ways that I understand better than I wish I did, but not empty, not hopeless, not beyond the possibility of becoming something greater than what the biotransference left you. He looked at Seth Ra, who stood near the gate's control systems, her sensor arrays dimmed to their lowest setting. You have something that your programming tells you is impossible, a capacity for connection, for recognition, for something that, in a species capable of feeling it fully, would be called compassion. It is buried deep, and it has been damaged by millennia of neglect. But it is there. I have seen it. I have felt it. And I believe it can grow, if you choose to let it. He turned to Thotep, who stood at rigid attention, his war scythe planted before him like a ceremonial standard. You were a father, Nemesaur. You cannot remember your son's face, but you remember that his face mattered. That is not a malfunction. That is the most alive thing about you. Hold on to it. Guard it as you would guard the dynasty itself, because that memory, that ache, that ghost of love is worth more than all the war scythes and Gauss flares and reanimation protocols in the galaxy. He looked at Katep. And you, Farron, you invoked a code of honor that has not been spoken in 60 million years. You rose from your throne for an alien prisoner who had no claim on your courtesy and no leverage to compel it. You did this because something in you remembered what it meant to act with honor rather than simply follow protocol. That something is not a ghost, it is not a relic. It is the best part of what you were, and it is fighting to survive inside what you have become. But let it fight. Help it win. Ketep's death mask displayed something that no Necron in the tomb had ever seen on a Pharaon's face. It was not any standard configuration. It was not programmed. It was emergent, organic in concept, if not in substance. Something that the living metal had created spontaneously in response to a stimulus it had no protocol for processing. It looked remarkably like gratitude. You have given us a gift, Brother Captain Galliard, Ketep said. A gift we did not know we needed and are not certain we deserve, but one that we will not waste. The gift was mutual, Pharaon. You gave me something equally precious. What did we give you? Proof. Proof that the struggle to remain human is not futile, that consciousness can endure transformation, and that the spark of who we are can survive even when everything else is stripped away. I have spent centuries wondering if my fight to preserve my humanity was meaningful or merely stubborn. You have shown me that it matters, that the choice to remain a person rather than a machine is the most important choice any being can make, and that it is never too late to make it. Seth Ra initiated the activation sequence. The Dolmen Gate's energies pulsed brighter, dimensional frequencies harmonizing as the boundary between real space and the webway thinned to transparency. The corridor beyond was a shifting landscape of crystal and light, the ancient architecture of the old ones still breathtaking after 60 million years. Galliard turned toward the gate. Behind him, the assembled dynasty stood in silence. Before him, the path home stretched into dimensional distance, uncertain and dangerous, but ultimately leading back to the Imperium he had sworn to serve. One last thing, he said, and there was something in his mechanical voice that transcended the limitations of speakers and amplifiers. The galaxy is vast, and the darkness presses in from every side. Your people and mine may meet again on battlefields where the imperative of survival leaves no room for the kind of understanding we have found here. If that happens, I want you to know that I will fight with everything I have. That is my duty and my calling. But I will fight remembering this, remembering that the enemy I face was once capable of honor, that the machines that oppose me were once people who felt joy and sorrow and love and loss. And that knowledge will make me a better warrior, not a weaker one. He paused. Because the greatest battles are not fought with weapons. They are fought in the soul, and a soul that has been reminded of its own worth is the most powerful weapon in the galaxy. He stepped toward the gate. One massive foot crossed the threshold between the material universe and the ancient network. The Aegis field flared as it met the webway's energies, silver light clashing with iridescent crystal, in a display that was, in its way, almost beautiful. And then Ketep spoke, his voice carrying across the subvault with an authority that transcended mere volume. "Go well, brother captain. Go well and remember us, not as machines, not as enemies, as what we were, and what we are trying, however imperfectly, to become again." Galliard's optical sensors blazed one final time, as twin points of blue-white light burning in his faceplate like distant stars. Then he stepped fully into the webway, and the gate sealed behind him, and the subvault was empty, except for the assembled Necrons, and the silence that settled over them like snowfall. It was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of aftermath. The silence that follows something important. The silence in which the echoes of words spoken continue to resonate, growing fainter, but never entirely fading, like ripples spreading across still water toward shores that may be distant but are undeniably real. And in that silence, in the green-lit depths of a tomb that had slept for 60 million years, something stirred. Not in the machinery, not in the protocols, in the spaces between. One where consciousness lived and memory survived, and the ghost of something that might have been a soul began, slowly, painfully, beautifully, to remember what it felt like to be alive. In the tomb below, the passage sealed and the desert reclaimed its secrets. Something changed. It was not a dramatic change. There were no declarations, no grand gestures, no sudden revelations. It was the kind of change that happens in the space between heartbeats, in the silence between words. The kind of change that is only noticed when you look back from a great distance and realize that things were different after than they were before. Seth Ra returned to her laboratories in the Eastern Wing, where the power distribution systems awaited her attention. The work was the same as it had been before the Grey Knight's arrival. The same conduits needed repair, the same relays needed recalibration, the same mathematical precision was required. Nothing about the technical requirements of her role had changed, but the way she approached them had shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way that a casual observer would notice, but in the small choices, the micro-decisions that constitute the fabric of daily existence. Something was different. She found herself taking more time with each repair, not because the work required it, but because she wanted to. She found herself examining the patterns of energy flow through the conduits with an attention that went beyond diagnostic necessity, noticing the way the green light played across the necrodermis surfaces, the way the power fluctuated in rhythms that reminded her of something she could not quite place. And when her diagnostic subroutines flagged these observations as inefficient, she did something she had never done before. She dismissed the warnings, not suppressed them, not overrode them, but acknowledged them and chose to continue anyway. The choice was small. The implications were vast. Across the tomb, other small changes accumulated. Cassette, the technomancer, began keeping a personal log of his repair work, recording not just the technical specifications, but the reasoning behind his decisions. The logs included observations that a strict interpretation of his programming would classify as superfluous, notes about the elegance of a particularly well-designed power coupling, reflections on the way different materials responded to repair techniques with what he described somewhat self-consciously as personality, as comments about the satisfaction he experienced when a complex repair was completed to his highest standards. He showed the logs to no one, but he kept them, and with each entry, the section of his memory, not designated for any particular purpose, grew a little less empty. Sekhmet requested a transfer from the Lichguard to the archives. The request was unusual enough to draw attention from the court's protocol officers, who noted that Lichguard did not transfer. Their role was sacred, their duty absolute. A Lichguard served until deactivation. To request reassignment was, if not unprecedented, certainly irregular. But Ketep approved the transfer without comment, and Sekhmet took up his new position among the archivists with a dedication that surprised everyone, including himself. He spent his hours organizing and cataloging the dynasty's cultural records, the poems and songs and histories that had survived the biotransference in fragmented, degraded form. Most were beyond recovery, corrupted by 60 million years of data decay. But some were intact enough to reconstruct, and Sekhmet found that the work of piecing them together stirred something in his processing architecture that he chose not to examine too closely. He could not write new poems, but he could preserve the old ones. And in the act of preservation, in the careful attention to rhythm and meter and the weight of each individual word, he found something that served, if not as a substitute for creation, then at least as a reminder that creation had once been possible. And then there was Ketep. The pharaoh sat on his throne in the grand processional and governed his dynasty with the same iron discipline that had characterized his rule since before the Great Sleep. Edicts were issued. Protocols were observed. The hierarchy functioned as it had for 60 million years, each consciousness in its proper place, each function fulfilled with mechanical precision. But Ketep had taken to spending the quiet hours between official functions in a chamber that no one else was permitted to enter. It was a small room by the tomb standards, barely 20 meters across, located deep in the residential section of the complex. The room contained nothing of military or strategic value. No weapon systems, no communications arrays, no tactical displays. It contained a window, not a real window. The tomb was buried kilometers beneath the planet's surface. Sunlight would never reach this deep. But Ketep had commissioned the cryptex to install a holographic display that simulated the view from the surface. It showed the desert stretching to the horizon under the dim light of the Verath system's distant sun. He sat before this simulated window and watched the simulated light change as the planet rotated. He watched the shadows lengthen and shorten. He watched the stars appear as the simulated sun set beyond the simulated horizon. And he remembered, not clearly, not with the vivid immediacy of organic memory, but he remembered. Fragments of color and sound from 60 million years ago, surfacing through layers of mechanical consciousness like bubbles rising through deep water. The amber light of the Necron-tier homeworld's sun as it set over mountains that had been dust for longer than most stars had burned. The sound of his daughter's laughter, a sound that existed now only as a mathematical description of audio frequencies, but that carried, even in that reduced form, the ghost of something that his programming insisted he could not feel. He sat before his window and let the memories come. He did not try to force them. He did not try to analyze or categorize them. He simply allowed them to exist, these fragments of a life that had ended 60 million years ago, these echoes of a consciousness that had been consumed by the biotransference and remade into something that was supposed to be beyond such fragile, useless things as feeling and memory and hope. The Grey Knight had asked him to remember, yet he was remembering, whether it would change anything, whether the memories would remain or fade, whether the small stirrings he felt in the depths of his consciousness were genuine emotion, or merely the mechanical simulation of emotion, he did not know. But the Grey Knight had not asked him to feel. He had asked him to remember. And memory, unlike feeling, was something that even a Necron could choose. Nemesor Thotep, of all the dynasty's nobles, perhaps showed the most surprising change. The military commander had been the most vocally opposed to the Grey Knight's presence, the most insistent on destruction, the most skeptical of any value in the exchange beyond pure intelligence gathering. And yet, in the weeks after Galliard's departure, Thotep found himself revisiting his tactical assessments of the battle against the Tyranid splinter fleet. The Grey Knights' integration into their battle line had been seamless. More than seamless. It had been inspired. The way Galliard had positioned himself to maximize the disruption of his Aegis field while maintaining overlapping fields of fire with the Necron formations spoke of a tactical mind that operated not just on data and probability, but on something else. Call it instinct, call it intuition, call it the indefinable quality that separated a merely competent commander from a truly gifted one. Thotep had that quality himself, or had possessed it once. Before the biotransference, he had been renowned for his ability to read a battlefield the way a musician reads a composition, as sensing the rhythms and harmonies of combat in ways that defied purely analytical explanation. The biotransference had preserved his tactical databases, his strategic algorithms, his vast library of military precedent. But it had taken the music. It had left him with the notes, but stripped away the melody. Watching Galliad fight, Thotep had recognized the music he had lost. The Grey Knight fought with an organic flow that no algorithm could replicate, transitioning between targets with a fluidity that spoke of genuine engagement rather than programmed response. He adapted to changing conditions, not by cycling through decision trees, but by feeling the shift in the battle's momentum and responding with an immediacy that bordered on prescience. It had been beautiful, and the fact that Thotep could recognize beauty in the midst of carnage, that he could appreciate the artistry of a warrior's craft beyond its purely functional value, told him something that his diagnostic subroutines immediately flagged as anomalous. He did not suppress the flag. He filed it alongside a growing collection of similar anomalies and chose, for the first time in 60 million years, to wonder what they meant. Far from Verath Secundus, in the cold depths of space, a Grey Knight's Dreadnought drifted through the void. His distress signal pulsed outward at the speed of light, carrying its encoded plea across the vast distances between stars. It would take time for the signal to reach anyone capable of responding. Months, perhaps years, perhaps longer. The galaxy was vast, and the spaces between its stars were vaster still. But Galliad was patient. He had been patient for over 4 centuries. And a few more years of drifting through the void held no terrors for him. His life support systems were functioning within acceptable parameters. His power reserves, topped off by Cassette's expert maintenance, were sufficient for decades of minimal operation. His Aegis field hummed at standby levels, a constant reminder that he was not merely a machine drifting through space, but a consciousness, a will, a warrior who had survived things that would have broken lesser beings. He spent the time in meditation and prayer. These were not empty rituals. For a Grey Knight, prayer was a psychic discipline, a focusing of mental energy that strengthened the wards and purified the soul. Each repetition of the sacred litanies reinforced the neural pathways that connected his consciousness to his faith. Each moment of contemplation deepened his understanding of the Emperor's will and his own place within the vast machinery of the Imperium's defense. But his meditations had acquired a new dimension since his time in the tomb. Where once his contemplative practice had been focused exclusively on the Emperor and the chapter's sacred mission, he now found his thoughts wandering to broader questions. Questions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the vessels that contained it. Questions about the boundaries between species and the possibilities that existed when those boundaries were acknowledged rather than enforced. Questions about what it meant to be alive in a galaxy where the definition of life was far more elastic than most of its inhabitants cared to admit. Yet he thought about Seth Ra and the way her consciousness had flickered when he spoke about buried emotions. He thought about Cassette and the care he had lavished on repairs that duty alone could not explain. He thought about Sekhmet and the way a warrior who had been a poet had remembered, after 60 million years, what poetry felt like. And he thought about Ketep, that ancient, powerful, supposedly emotionless ruler who had spoken the word friend with a voice that carried the weight of a choice more significant than any military decision he had ever made. They were aliens, Xenos. By the doctrine of the Imperium, they were enemies to be destroyed, threats to be eliminated, obstacles to be overcome in humanity's manifest destiny to rule the stars. Galliad had been raised on this doctrine, where he had fought and killed Xenos across a dozen worlds. He had never questioned the fundamental rightness of the Imperium's stance toward non-human intelligences. He was questioning it now, not the strategic necessity of defending humanity against alien threats. That remained as clear and urgent as ever. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and the species that inhabited it were, more often than not, hostile to human interests. But the blanket categorization of all non-human consciousness as inherently inferior, inherently threatening, inherently other, This he could no longer accept without reservation. The Necrons of the Saracen dynasty had shown him something that complicated the simple binary of friend and foe. They had shown him that consciousness, regardless of its substrate, shared certain fundamental qualities: the desire for meaning, and the capacity for growth, the recognition of beauty, the stubborn persistence of identity in the face of forces that sought to erase it. These were not uniquely human qualities. They were qualities of consciousness itself. And if consciousness could recognize itself across the divide of species and circumstance, then the categories by which the galaxy's inhabitants classified each other were, at best, incomplete. It was a dangerous thought, a thought that the Inquisition would classify as borderline heretical, a thought that could, if expressed to the wrong audience, end his career and possibly his existence. Galliard filed it away alongside Sekhmet's poem and the memory of Ketep's voice speaking the word friend. Some knowledge was not meant to be shared, but preserved, carried quietly in the depths of one's consciousness, like a seed waiting for the right moment to germinate. The signal was detected 17 months later by a Grey Knight's strike cruiser on patrol in the Hadrian sector. The encryption was verified, the identification confirmed. A Grey Knight, lost for over 4 centuries, was broadcasting from an uncharted system on the edge of known space. The strike cruiser altered course immediately. Within weeks, it arrived at the coordinates and found the Dreadnought drifting in the void. Scans confirmed that the chassis was intact, life support was functional, and the occupant was alive. Recovery operations were initiated with all due haste. When Galliard's systems were connected to the strike cruiser's power grid, and his consciousness fully restored, he found himself surrounded by faces he did not recognize. Young Marines, barely out of their scout companies, who looked at his Dreadnought chassis with awe and reverence. To them, he was a legend, an ancient one, a living relic of the chapter's glorious past. Brother Captain Aureus, commanding the strike cruiser, delivered the debriefing in the ship's chapel. He was a relatively young officer by Grey Knight standards, perhaps 2 centuries of service, and he approached the returned ancient with a deference that Galliard found both touching and slightly uncomfortable. "Your recovery is a miracle, Ancient One. The chapter had listed you as lost during the Vereth incident. No survivors from the Sword of Purity's last stand were ever recovered." "There were survivors. A shuttle escaped the surface. I saw it launch before my cradle fell." The shuttle was recovered 37 years after the incident. The survivors reported that the ship was destroyed with all hands and material. They had no knowledge of your survival. So it was confirmed. He had been written off, his name carved on the memorial wall in the halls beneath Titan, his legacy consigned to history. "I will need to provide a full account of my experiences," Galliard said, "to the appropriate authorities. Of course, the Brotherhood will want a complete debrief." And here was the moment of choice, the moment where Galliard would have to decide what to include in his account and what to omit. He had given his word to Seth Ra. He had promised to protect the dynasty's sensitive information, but he had also sworn oaths to the Emperor and the Ordo Malleus. The obligations pulled in different directions, and the tension between them required careful navigation. In the end, he told the truth, but not all of it. He reported that his stasis cradle had fallen into a subterranean complex during the battle, that the complex appeared to be an ancient alien installation, long abandoned, that his stasis systems had sustained him for over 4 centuries until the complex's deteriorating power grid had triggered his awakening, that he had managed to repair his systems sufficiently to reach the surface and broadcast a distress signal. He did not mention the Necrons. He did not mention the conversations. He did not mention the battle against the Tyranids, or the right of reciprocity, or the word friend, spoken by an ancient voice in a chamber of living metal. The debriefing officers accepted his account. Why would they not? A Grey Knight's word was sacrosanct, and the story was plausible enough. Alien ruins were common across the galaxy, and stasis preservation over extended periods, while rare, was not unheard of. Only one detail raised questions: The repairs to his chassis included materials that the tech marines could not identify, patches of a silvery substance that responded to diagnostic scans in ways that ceramite and adamantium did not. The substance appeared to be inert, but spectral analysis revealed molecular structures of extraordinary complexity. Some kind of alien alloy, the tech marines concluded. The installation must have contained automated repair systems that attempted to maintain the Dreadnought during its extended dormancy. Crude, but functional. Galliard said nothing. Let them think what they would. Oh, the truth was more extraordinary than anything they could imagine, and it was not his to share. In the years that followed his recovery, Galliard served the Grey Knights with renewed purpose. He fought in campaigns across the sector, his tactical wisdom and psychic power proving as valuable as they had ever been. His battle brothers noted that there was something different about the Ancient One since his return. A warmth in his interactions that had not been there before. A tendency to remember names and faces with a deliberateness that went beyond military courtesy. A habit of pausing in quiet moments between the violence to look at the stars with an attention that seemed to go beyond mere observation. When young Marines asked him about his time lost in the void, he spoke in general terms about the importance of faith and perseverance. But occasionally, when the moment was right and the audience was receptive, he would say something that hinted at a deeper understanding. Remember that we fight not just to destroy the enemy, he would say, but to preserve what makes us who we are. The galaxy is full of threats that seek to consume our identity, to reduce us to nothing more than weapons in someone else's war. The greatest victory is not the destruction of our foes, but the preservation of our humanity. The young Marines would nod respectfully and file the wisdom away alongside the other teachings of their ancient. They did not know that the lesson had been learned not in battle against demons or heretics, but in conversation with beings who had been fighting the same war against the erosion of their own identity for 60 million years. And on the rare occasions when Galliard was alone, when the ship was quiet and the stars burned cold and distant outside the viewport, he would take a small disc of silvery metal from its place within his chassis and hold it in the grip of his power fist, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a weapon capable of crushing tank armor. He could not read the inscription. He had never asked for a translation. The meaning of the words was less important than the meaning of the gesture. A warrior who had been a poet, remembering what poetry felt like, a consciousness that was supposed to be empty, choosing to create something beautiful, connection across impossible distance. In the tomb of farthest Secundus, the Saracen dynasty continued its awakening. Stasis crypts opened, nobles emerged, the hierarchy filled out. The military strength of the dynasty grew with each passing year. Eventually, the tomb would be fully operational, its population restored, its armies mobilized, its place in the galaxy's shifting power dynamics secured. But in the quiet spaces between the duties and protocols, in the moments when the machinery of governance paused and the individual consciousnesses that comprised the dynasty were left alone with their thoughts, something persisted. A question, a possibility, a memory of a conversation with a being who should have been nothing more than an enemy to be destroyed, but who had instead become something for which the Necrons did not have a word. Seth Ra kept a private file, encrypted with codes known only to herself, in which she recorded observations that her programming classified as anomalous, instances where her responses to stimuli exceeded the parameters of pure logic, moments where her attention was drawn to phenomena that served no practical purpose, but that she found, for reasons she could not define, worth noticing. She did not call these observations emotions, but she did not delete them either. Cassette maintained his personal logs, adding entries with increasing frequency and decreasing self-consciousness. The logs evolved from dry technical records into something more closely resembling a journal, a record of experiences and reflections that went beyond the mechanical requirements of his role. He began sharing some entries with other technomancers, carefully selected colleagues who responded to the content with interest rather than alarm. A small community of Necrons, who had quietly begun documenting what they privately called stirrings, formed in the engineering sections of the tomb. They did not advertise their activities, but they did not hide them either. Sekhmet's work in the archives became something of a legend within the dynasty. He reconstructed over 300 pre-biotransference poems from fragmentary data, filling in gaps with editorial choices that demonstrated a sensitivity to language and rhythm that should have been impossible for a being who claimed to have lost his creative capacity. When challenged on this point by a senior archivist, Sekhmet replied that he was not creating, he was remembering. The distinction was important to him, even if no one else understood why. And Ketep sat before his simulated window and watched the stars, and remembered, and waited, not for anything specific, not with any expectation or goal, but with the quiet patience of a being who had been given a reason to believe that the waiting might not be forever. That somewhere in the vast machinery of his consciousness, beneath the programming and the protocols and 60 million years of mechanical existence, there was still something worth waiting for. The galaxy spun on, indifferent to the small dramas playing out on its margins. Wars raged, empires rose and fell, species were born and died and were reborn in forms their ancestors would not have recognized. The great game of survival continued as it always had and always would, played out across 1 million worlds under alien stars, by players who believed, each and every one of them, that their cause was righteous and their enemies were wrong. But in two small corners of that vast and terrible cosmos, separated by distances measured in light years but connected by something that transcended physical space, two consciousnesses carried the memory of an encounter that had changed them both. A warrior in a tomb of imperial design, carrying a poem he could not read. A ruler in a tomb of Necron design, watching stars through a window that was not real. Both of them remembering, both of them choosing to feel, even when feeling brought pain. Both of them holding on to the stubborn, irrational, magnificent conviction that consciousness was more than just a pattern of energy in a substrate of metal. That identity could survive transformation. That the spark of what made a being more than just a process could endure even the most radical alteration of its physical form. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, this is not much. It will not end the great conflicts that consume the galaxy. It will not bring peace to species that have been fighting since before the stars were young. It will not heal the wounds that the galaxy inflicts on those who dare to inhabit it. But it is something small and fragile and precious, something that no weapon can destroy and no machine can replicate and no amount of time can entirely erase. It is the memory of a moment when two beings, separated by everything that should have made them enemies, chose instead to recognize each other as kin, chose to see past the metal and the weapons and the 60-million-year gulf of history to the consciousness beneath, chose to believe that the spark of identity, as of feeling, of what for lack of a better word we might call soul, could endure anything. Even the slow erosion of everything that makes you who you are. Even the transformation of flesh into metal and thought into process. Even 60 million years of darkness. Even the silence between the stars. That is the story of what happened when the Necrons of the Saracon dynasty found a Grey Knight's Dreadnought asleep in their tomb. It is a story about machines that remembered what it meant to be alive, and a warrior who reminded them. It is a story about the persistence of consciousness and the endurance of identity. It is a story about hope, which is the rarest and most dangerous thing in a galaxy that has spent 10,000 years trying to extinguish it. There is a lesson buried in this story that extends beyond the fictional universe in which it takes place. It is a lesson about what happens when we reduce ourselves or others to categories, when we see only the armor and not the person inside it, when we interact with the function and forget the consciousness, when we dismiss the possibility of connection because the being standing in front of us does not look like us, does not think like us, does not experience the world the way we do. Galliard and the Necrons of the Saracen dynasty found something together that neither could have found alone. The Grey Knight found proof that his struggle to maintain his humanity was not a futile act of defiance against the inevitable, but a meaningful choice with real consequences. As he found that his refusal to become merely a weapon resonated across species boundaries, across technological gulfs, across 60 million years of divergent history. His stubborn insistence on remaining Theron Galliard, rather than Dreadnought serial number whatever, turned out to be not just personally significant, but universally significant. A demonstration that consciousness, once awakened to its own worth, becomes a force that transcends the vessel that contains it. And the Necrons found something equally precious. They found that the emptiness they had accepted as permanent, the void where their emotions and their capacity for connection had once lived, was not as empty as they had believed. The Grey Knight's presence, his faith, his humanity, served as a catalyst that reminded them of what they had lost, and, more importantly, yet of what they might still recover. Not all of it, perhaps not even most of it. The biotransference took more than any single encounter could restore, but enough. Enough to make the difference between existing and living. Enough to transform a tomb into something that, with time and effort and the stubborn refusal to accept that dead things stay dead, might become something worth calling home. Consider for a moment the sheer improbability of it. A Grey Knight's Dreadnought, one of the rarest and most secret weapons in the Imperium's arsenal, falling through a crack in a ship's hull into the deepest vault of a Necron tomb world, sleeping there for centuries while the machines of an ancient civilization hummed around him, unaware that the anomaly in their sub-vault contained a consciousness that would, upon awakening, it challenged the fundamental assumptions of their existence. What are the odds? In a galaxy of billions of stars, trillions of worlds, and countless civilizations fighting and dying and struggling for survival against the darkness that presses in from every side, what are the chances that one specific consciousness would end up in the one specific place where its presence could make this particular difference? Perhaps it was chance. Perhaps it was the kind of cosmic accident that happens when the universe is vast enough and time is long enough for every possible combination of events to eventually occur. Perhaps there was no meaning in it at all, just the blind mechanics of probability playing out across the endless stage of the galaxy. Or perhaps there is something in the universe that ensures that the right consciousness ends up in the right place at the right time. Not a god, necessarily. Not a plan, just the natural tendency of minds to find each other across the distances and differences that separate them, the gravitational pull of consciousness toward consciousness, the way that a signal, any signal, will eventually find a receiver tuned to its frequency, if both parties are willing to listen. Whatever the explanation, the result speaks for itself. Two species that should have been enemies found common ground. Two forms of consciousness that should have been incompatible found a shared language. Two beings trapped in metal shells, one by choice and one by betrayal, found in each other the mirror they needed to see themselves clearly. And if you have made it this far, if you have listened to these words and followed this story to its end, then I want to thank you for that. This is Q on 40,000, and I tell these stories because I believe they matter. Because in the vast, complicated, endlessly fascinating universe of Warhammer 40,000, there are moments of beauty hidden among the horror, moments of connection amid the isolation, moments where beings who have every reason to hate each other choose instead to understand. If you enjoyed this story, if it made you think or feel or see the 40,000 universe from an angle you had not considered before, then do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, share this with someone who might appreciate it, and leave a comment telling me what you thought. I read every single one, and your engagement is what keeps this channel alive and allows me to keep telling these stories. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is war. But there is also memory, there is also choice. And as long as consciousness endures, there is always, always the possibility that something better waits on the other side of the darkness. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.